The Adventurer by C.M. Kornbluth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 4 science fiction stories by C.M. Kornbluth. Story number 1, The Adventurer. This story was first published in Space Science Fiction, May 1953. President Folsom the 24th said petulantly to his Secretary of the Treasurer, "Blow me to hell, Bannister, if I understand a single word of that. Why can't I buy the Nicolaides collection? And don't start with the rediscounted the Series W business again. Just tell me why." The Secretary of the Treasury said, with an air of apprehension and a thread-like feeling across his throat, "It boils down to no money, Mr. President." The President was too engrossed in thoughts of the marvelous collection to fly into a rage. "It's such a bargain," he said mournfully. "An archaic Henry Moore figure, really too big to finger, but I'm no culture snob, thank God. And 15 early Morrisons, and I can't begin to tell you what else." He looked hopefully at the Secretary of Public Opinion. "Mightn't I seize it for the public good or something?" The Secretary of Public Opinion shook his head. His prose was gruffly professional. "Not a chance, Mr. President. We'd never get away with it. The art lovers would scream to high heaven." "I suppose so. Why isn't there any money?" He had swiveled dangerously on the Secretary of the Treasury again. "Sir, purchases of the new Series W bond issue have lagged badly because potential buyers have been attracted to—" "Stop it, stop it, stop it! You know I can't make head or tail of that stuff. Where's the money going?" The Director of the Budget said cautiously, "Mr. President, during the biennium just ending, the Department of Defense accounted for 78% of expenditures." The Secretary of Defense growled, "Now, wait a minute, Felder. We were voted—" The President interrupted, raging weakly, "Oh, you rascals! My father would have known what to do with you. But don't think I can't handle it. Don't think you can hoodwink me." He punched a button ferociously. His silly face was contorted with rage, and there was a certain tension on all the faces around the cabinet table. Panels slid down abruptly in the walls, revealing grim-faced Secret Servicemen. Each cabinet officer was covered by at least 2 automatic rifles. "Take that traitor away!" the President yelled. His finger pointed at the Secretary of Defense, who slumped over the table sobbing. 2 Secret Servicemen have carried him from the room. President Folsom the 24th leaned back, thrusting out his lower lip. He told the Secretary of the Treasury, "Get me the money for the Nicolaides collection. Do you understand? I don't care how you do it. Get it." He glared at the Secretary of Public Opinion. "Have you any comments?" "No, Mr. President." "All right, then." The President unbent and said plaintively, "I don't see why you can't all be more reasonable. I'm a very reasonable man. I don't see why I can't have a few pleasures along with my responsibilities. Really, I don't. And I'm sensitive. I don't like these scenes. Very well, that's all. The cabinet meeting is adjourned." They rose and left silently in the order of their seniority. The President noticed that the panels were still down and pushed the button that raised them again and hid the granite-faced Secret Serviceman. He took out of his pocket a late Morrison fingering piece and turned it over in his hand, a smile of relaxation and bliss spreading over his face. Such amusing textural contrast, such unexpected variations on the classic sequences. The Cabinet, less the Secretary of Defense, was holding a rump meeting in an untapped corner of the White House gymnasium. "God," the Secretary of State said, white-faced, Poor old Willie. The professorially gruff Secretary of Public Opinion said, "We should murder the bastard. I don't care what happens." The Director of the Budget said dryly, "We all know what would happen. President Folsom the 25th would take office. No, we've got to keep plugging as before. Nothing short of the invincible can topple the Republic." "What about a war?" the Secretary of Commerce demanded fiercely. "We've no proof that our program will work. What about a war?" State said wearily, "Not while there's a balance of power, my dear man. The Io-Callisto question proved that. The Republic and the Soviet fell all over themselves trying to patch things up as soon as it seemed there would be real shooting. Folsom the 24th and His Excellency Premier Yersinsky know at least that much." The Secretary of the Treasury said, "What do you think of Steiner for defense?" The Director of the Budget was astonished. Would he take it? Treasury cleared his throat. "As a matter of fact, I've asked him to stop by right now." He hurled a medicine ball into the budgetary gut. "Ooh," said the Director. "You bastard. Steiner would be perfect. He runs Standard like a watch." He treacherously fired the medicine ball at the Secretary of Raw Materials, who blandly caught it and slammed it back. "Here he comes," said the Secretary of Raw Materials. "Steiner, come and sweat some oleo off." Steiner ambled over, a squat man in his 50s, and said, "I don't mind if I do. Where's Willie?" State said, "The President unmasked him as a traitor. He's probably been executed by now." Steiner looked grim, and grimmer yet, when the Secretary of Treasury said, deadpan, "We want to propose you for defense." "I'm happy in Standards," Steiner said. "Safer, too. The man's father took an interest in science, but the man never comes around. Things are very quiet. Why don't you invite Winch from the National Art Commission? It wouldn't be much of a change for the worse for him." "No brains," the Secretary of Raw Materials said briefly. "Heads up." Steiner caught the ball and slugged it back at him. "What good are brains?" he asked quietly. "Close the ranks, gentlemen," State said. "These long shots are too hard on my arms." The ranks closed, and the Cabinet told Steiner what good were brains. He ended by accepting. The moon is all Republic. Mars is all Soviet. Titan is all Republic. Ganymede is all Soviet. But Io and Callisto, by the Treaty of Greenwich, are half and half Republic and Soviet. Down the main street of the principal settlement of Io runs an invisible line. On one side of the line, the principal settlement is known as New Pittsburgh. On the other side, it is known as Nizhny Magnitogorsky. Into a miner's home in New Pittsburgh one night, an 8-year-old boy named Grayson staggered, bleeding from the head. His eyes were swollen almost shut. His father lurched to his feet, knocking over a bottle. He looked stupidly at the bottle, set it upright too late to save much of the alcohol, and then stared fixedly at the boy. "Say what you made me do, you little bastard," he growled, and fetched the boy a clout on his bleeding head that sent him spinning against the wall of the hut. The boy got up slowly and silently. There seemed to be something wrong with his left arm, and glowered at his father. He said nothing. "Fighting again," the father said in a would-be fierce voice. His eyes fell under the peculiar fire in the boy's stare. "Damn fool!" A woman came in from the kitchen. She was tall and thin. In a flat voice she said to the man, "Get out of here." The man hiccuped and said, "Your brat spilled my bottle. Give me $1. In the same flat voice, "I have to buy food." "I said give me $1. The man slapped her face. It did not change, and wrenched a small purse from the string that suspended it around her neck. The boy suddenly was a demon, flying at his father with fists and teeth. It lasted only a second or two. The father kicked him into a corner where he lay, still glaring, wordless, and dry-eyed. The mother had not moved. Her husband's hand-mark was still red on her face when he hulked out clutching the money bag. Mrs. Grayson at last crouched in the corner with the 8-year-old boy. "Little Tommy," she said softly, "my little Tommy, did you cross the line again?" He was blubbering in her arms hysterically as she caressed him. At last he was able to say, "I didn't cross the line, Mom. Not this time. It was in school. They said our name was really Krasinski." "God damn him," the boy shrieked. "They said his grandfather was named Krasinski, and he moved over the line and changed his name to Grayson. God damn him, doing that to us." "Now, darling," his mother said, caressing him. "Now, darling." His trembling began to ebb. She said, "Let's get out the spools, Tommy. You mustn't fall behind in school. You owe that to me, don't you, darling?" "Yes, Mom," he said. He threw his spindly arms around her and kissed her. "Get out the spools. We'll show him. Them." President Folsom the 24th lay on his deathbed, feeling no pain, mostly because his personal physician had pumped him full of morphine. Dr. Barnes sat by the bed, holding the presidential wrist and waiting, occasionally nodding off and recovering with a belligerent stare around the room. The 4 wire service men didn't care whether he fell asleep or not. They were worriedly discussing the nature and habits of the president's firstborn, who would shortly succeed to the highest office in the republic. "A firebrand, they tell me," the AP man said unhappily. "Firebrands I don't mind," the UP man said. "He can send out all the inflammatory notes he wants, just as long as he isn't a fiend for exercise. I'm not as young as I once was. You boys wouldn't remember the old President Folsom the 22nd. He used to do point-to-point hiking. He worshipped old FDR," the INS man said, lowering his voice. "Then he was worshipping the wrong Roosevelt. Teddy was the athlete." Dr. Barnes started, dropped the presidential wrist, and held a mirror to the mouth for a moment. "Gentlemen," he said, "the president is dead." "Okay," the AP man said. "Let's go, boys. I'll send in the flash. UP, you go cover the College of Electors. INS, get on to the president-elect. Trib, collect some interviews and background." The door opened abruptly. A colonel of infantry was standing there, breathing hard, with an automatic rifle at port. "Is he dead?" he asked. "Yes," the AP man said. "If you'll let me past." "Nobody leaves the room," the colonel said grimly. "I represent General Slocum, acting president of the Republic. The College of Electors is acting now to ratify—" A burst of gunfire caught the colonel in the back. He spun and fell with a single hoarse cry. More gunfire sounded through the White House. A Secret Service man ducked his head through the door. "President's dead? You boys stay put. We'll have this thing cleaned up in an hour." He vanished. The doctor sputtered his alarm, and the newsman ignored him with professional poise. The AP man said, "Now, who's Slocum? Defense Command?" INS said, "I remember him. 3 stars. He headed up the Tactical Airborne Force out in Kansas 4 or 5 years ago. I think he was retired since then." A phosphorus grenade crashed through the window and exploded with a globe of yellow flame the size of a basketball. Dense clouds of phosphorus pentoxide gushed from it, and the sprinkler system switched on, drenching the room. "Come on!" hacked the AP man, and they scrambled from the room and slammed the door. The doctor's coat was burning in 2 or 3 places, and he was retching feebly on the corridor floor. They tore his coat off and flung it back into the room. The UP man, swearing horribly, dug a sizzling bit of phosphorus from the back of his hand with a penknife and collapsed sweating when it was out. The INS man passed him a flask, and he gurgled down half a pint of liquor. "Who flung that brick?" he asked faintly. Nobody, the AP man said gloomily. That's the hell of it. None of this is happening. Just the way Taft the Pretender never happened in '03, just the way the Pentagon Mutiny never happened in '67. 68, the UP man said faintly. It didn't happen in '68, not '67. The AP man smashed a fist into the palm of his hand and swore. God damn, he said. Someday I'd like to... He broke off and was bitterly silent. The UP man must have been a little dislocated with shock and quite drunk to talk the way he did. Me too, he said. Like to tell the story. Maybe it was '67, not '68. I'm not sure now. Can't write it down so the details get lost, and then after a while it didn't happen at all. Revolution'd be good deal, but it takes people to make revolution. People with eyes and ears and memories. We make things not happen, and we make people not see and not hear. He slumped back against the corridor wall, nursing his burned hand. The others were watching him, very scared. Then the AP man caught sight of the Secretary of Defense striding down the corridor, flanked by Secret Service men. Mr. Steiner, he called, what's the picture? Steiner stopped, breathing heavily, and said, Slocum's barricaded in the Oval study. They don't want to smash in. He's about the only one left. There were only 50 or so. The acting president's taking charge at the study. You want to come along? They did, and even hauled the UP man after them. The acting president, who would be President Folsom the 25th, as soon as the Electoral College got around to it, had his father's face, the petulant lip, the soft jowl on a hard young body. He also had an auto rifle ready to fire from the hip. Most of the cabinet was present. When the Secretary of Defense arrived, he turned on him. Steiner, he said nastily, can you explain why there should be a rebellion against the Republic in your department? Mr. President, Steiner said, Slocum was retired on my recommendation 2 years ago. It seemed to me that my responsibility ended there and security should have taken over. The President-elect's finger left the trigger of the auto rifle and his lip drew in a little. Quite so, he said curtly, and turned to the door. Slocum, he shouted, come out of there. We can use gas if we want. The door opened unexpectedly, and a tired-looking man with 3 stars on each shoulder stood there, barehanded. All right, he said drearily. I was fool enough to think something could be done about the regime, but you fat-faced imbeciles are going to go on and on and... The stutter of the auto rifle cut him off. The President-elect's knuckles were white as he clutched the piece's forearm in grip. The torrent of slugs continued to hack and plow the general's body until the magazine was empty. Burn that, he said curtly, turning his back on it. Dr. Barnes, come here. I want to know about my father's passing. The doctor, hoarse and red-eyed from the whiff of phosphorus smoke, spoke with him. The UP man had staggered drunkenly into a chair, but the other newsmen noted that Dr. Barnes glanced at them as he spoke in a confidential murmur. Thank you, Doctor, the President-elect said at last, decisively. He gestured to a Secret Serviceman. Take those traitors away. They went numbly. The Secretary of State cleared his throat. Mr. President, he said, I take this opportunity to submit the resignations of myself and fellow cabinet members according to custom. That's all right, the President-elect said. You may as well stay on. I intend to run things myself anyway. He hefted the auto rifle. You, he said to the Secretary of Public Opinion, you have some work to do. Have the memory of my father's artistic preoccupations obliterated as soon as possible. I wish the Republic to assume a warlike posture. Yes, what is it? A trembling messenger said, Mr. President, I have the honor to inform you that the College of Electors has elected you President of the Republic unanimously. Cadet fourth-classman Thomas Grayson lay on his bunk and sobbed in an agony of loneliness. The letter from his mother was crumpled in his hand. "Prouder than words can tell of your appointment to the academy, darling. I hardly knew my grandfather, but I know that you will serve as brilliantly as he did, to the eternal credit of the Republic. You must be brave and strong for my sake." He would have given everything he had, or ever could hope to have, to be back with her, and away from the bullying, sneering fellow cadets of the Corps. He kissed the letter, and then hastily shoved it under his mattress as he heard footsteps. He popped to a brace, but it was only his roommate, Ferguson. Ferguson was from Earth, and rejoiced in the lighter lunar gravity, which was punishment to Grayson's Io-bred muscles. "Rest, mister," Ferguson grinned. "Thought it was night inspection." "Any minute now. They're down the hall. Let me tighten your bunk, or you'll be in trouble." Tightening the bunk, he pulled out the letter and said calvishly, "Aha! Who is she?" and opened it. When the cadet officers reached the room, they found Ferguson on the floor, being strangled black in the face by spidery little Grayson. It took all three of them to pull him off. Ferguson went to the infirmary, and Grayson went to the commandant's office. The commandant glared at the cadet from under the most spectacular pair of eyebrows in the service. "Cadet Grayson," he said, "explain what occurred." "Sir, Cadet Ferguson began to read a letter from my mother without my permission." "That is not accepted by the Corps as grounds for mayhem. Do you have anything further to say?" "Sir, I lost my temper. All I thought of was that it was an act of disrespect to my mother, and somehow to the Corps and the Republic too, that Cadet Ferguson was dishonoring the Corps." Bushwash, the commander thought. A snow job, and a crude one. He studied the youngster. He had never seen such a brace from an Io-bred fourth-classman. It must be torture to muscles not yet toughened up to even lunar gravity. 5 minutes more and the boy would have to give way, and serve him right for showing off. He studied Grayson's folder. It was too early to tell about academic work, but the fourth-classman was a bear or a fool for extra duty. He had gone out for 6 teams and applied for membership in the exacting math club and writing club. The commandant glanced up. Grayson was still in his extreme brace. The commandant suddenly had the queer idea that Grayson could hold it until it killed him. 100 hours of pack drill, he barked, to be completed before quarter term. Cadet Grayson, if you succeed in walking off your tours, remember that there is a tradition of fellowship in the Corps which its members are expected to observe. Dismiss. After Grayson's steel-sharp salute and exit, the commandant dug deeper into the folder. Apparently there was something wrong with the boy's left arm, but it had been passed by the examining team that visited Io. Most unusual. Most irregular. But nothing could be done about it now. The president, softer now in body than on his election day and infinitely more cautious, snapped. "It's all very well to create an incident, but where's the money to come from? Who wants the rest of Io anyway? And what will happen if there's war?" Treasury said, "The hoarders will supply the money, Mr. President. A system of percentage bounties for people who report currency hoarders, and then enforced purchase of a bond issue." Raw materials said, "We need that iron, Mr. President. We need it desperately." State said, "All our evaluations indicate that the Soviet premier would consider nothing less than armed invasion of his continental borders as an occasion for all-out war. The Consumer Goods Party in the Soviet has gained immensely during the past 5 years, and of course their armaments have suffered. Your shrewd directive to put the Republic in a warlike posture has borne fruit, Mr. President." President Folsom the 25th studied them narrowly. To him, the need for a border incident culminating in a forced purchase of Soviet Io did not seem as pressing as they thought. But they were, after all, specialists, and there was no conceivable way they could benefit from it personally. The only alternative was that they were offering their professional advice, and that it would be best to heed it. Still, there was a vague, nagging something. Nonsense, he decided. The spy dossiers on his cabinet showed nothing but the usual. One had been blackmailed by an actress after an affair and railroaded her off the earth. Another had a habit of taking bribes to advance favorite sons in civil and military service, and so on. The Republic could not suffer at their hands. The Republic and the dynasty were impregnable. You simply spied on everybody, including the spies, and ordered summary executions often enough to show that you meant it, and kept the public ignorant. Deaf, dumb, blind, ignorant. The spy system was simplicity itself. You had only to let things get as tangled and confused as possible until nobody knew who was who. The executions were literally no problem, for guilt or innocence made no matter. And mind control, when there were 4 newspapers, 6 magazines, and 3 radio and television stations, was a job for a handful of clerks. No, the cabinet wasn't getting away with anything. The system was unbeatable. President Folsom the 25th said, "Very well, have it done." Mrs. Grayson, widow of New Pittsburgh, Iowa, disappeared one night. It was in all the papers and on all the broadcasts. Some time later she was found dragging herself back across the line between Nizhny Magnitogorsk and New Pittsburgh in sorry shape. She had a terrible tale to tell about what she had suffered at the hands and so forth of the Magnitogorskniks. A diplomatic note from the Republic to the Soviet was answered by another note, which was answered by the dispatch of the Republic's First Fleet to Io, which was answered by the dispatch of the Soviet's First and Fifth Fleets to Io. The Republic's First Fleet blew up the customary deserted target hulk, fulminated over a sneak sabotage attack, and moved in its destroyers. Battle was joined. Ensign Thomas Grayson took over the command of his destroyer when its captain was killed on his bridge. An electrified crew saw the strange, brooding youngster perform prodigies of skill and courage and responded to them. In 1 week of desultory action, the battered destroyer had accounted for 7 Soviet destroyers and a cruiser. As soon as this penetrated to the flagship, Grayson was decorated and given a flotilla. His weird magnetism extended to every officer and man aboard the 7 craft. They struck like phantoms, cutting out cruisers and battle wagons in wild, unorthodox actions that couldn't have succeeded, but did every time. Grayson was badly wounded twice, but his driving, nervous energy carried him through. He was decorated again and given the battle wagon of an ailing four-striper. Without orders, he touched down on the Soviet side of Io, led out a landing party of Marines and Blue Jackets, cut through 2 regiments of Soviet infantry, and returned to his battle wagon with prisoners, the top civil and military administrators of Soviet Io. They discussed him nervously aboard the flagship. "He has a mystical quality, Admiral. His men would follow him into an atomic furnace, and I almost believe he could bring them through safely if he wanted to." The laugh was nervous. "He doesn't look like much, but when he turns on the charm, watch out. He's a winner. Now I wonder what I meant by that." "I know what you mean. They turn up every so often. People who can't be stopped. People who have everything. Napoleons, Alexanders, Stalins, up from nowhere. Suleiman, Hitler, Folsom the First, Genghis Khan. Well, let's get it over with." They tugged at their gold-braided jackets and signaled the honor guard. Grayson was piped aboard, received another decoration and another speech. This time he made a speech in return. President Folsom the 25th, not knowing what else to do, had summoned his cabinet. "Well?" he rasped at the Secretary of Defense. Steiner said with a faint shrug, Mr. President, there's nothing to be done. He has the fleet. He has the broadcasting facilities. He has the people. People, snarled the president. His finger jabbed at a button and the wall panels snapped down to show the Secret Servicemen standing in their niches. The finger shot tremulously out at Steiner. Kill that traitor, he raved. The chief of the detail said uneasily, Mr. President, we were listening to Grayson before we came on duty. He said he's de facto president now. Kill him! Kill him! The chief went on doggedly. And we liked what he had to say about the Republic, and he said citizens of the Republic shouldn't take orders from you, and he'd relieve you. The president fell back. Grayson walked in, wearing his plain ensign's uniform and smiling faintly. Admirals and four-stripers flanked him. The chief of the detail said, Mr. Grayson, are you taking over? The man in the ensign's uniform said gravely, Yes, and just call me Grayson, please. The titles come later. You can go now. The chief gave a pleased grin and collected his detail. The rather slight youngish man who had something wrong with one arm was in charge. Complete charge. Grayson said, Mr. Folsom, you are relieved of the presidency. Captain, take him out and... He finished with a whimsical shrug. A portly four-striper took Folsom by one arm. Like a drugged man, the deposed president let himself be let out. Grayson looked around the table. Who are you, gentlemen? They felt his magnetism, like the hum when you pass a power station. Steiner was the spokesman. Grayson, he said soberly, we are Folsom's cabinet. However, there is more that we have to tell you, alone if you will allow it. Very well, gentlemen. Admirals and captains backed out, looking concerned. Steiner said, Grayson, the story goes back many years. My predecessor, William Malvern, determined to overthrow the regime, holding that it was an affront to the human spirit. There have been many such attempts. All have broken up on the rocks of espionage, terrorism, and opinion control, the three weapons which the regime holds firmly in its hands. Malvern tried another approach than espionage versus espionage, terrorism versus terrorism, and opinion control versus opinion control. He determined to use the basic fact that certain men make history, that there are men born to be mold breakers. There are the Philips of Macedon, the Napoleons, Stalins and Hitlers, the Suleimans, the adventurers. Again and again they flash across history, bringing down an ancient empire, turning ordinary soldiers of the line into unkillable demons of battle, uprooting cultures, breathing new life into moribund peoples. There are common denominators among all the adventurers. Intelligence, of course. Other things are more mysterious, but are always present. They are foreigners. Napoleon the Corsican, Hitler the Austrian, Stalin the Georgian, Philip the Macedonian. Always there is an Oedipus complex. Always there is physical deficiency. Napoleon's stature, Stalin's withered arm, and yours. Always there is a minority disability, real or fancied. This is a shock to you, Grayson, but you must face it. You were manufactured. Malvern packed the cabinet with the slyest double-dealers he could find, and they went to work. 86 infants were planted on the outposts of the Republic, in simulated family environments. Your mother was not your mother, but one of the most brilliant actresses ever to drop out of sight on Earth. Your intelligence heredity was so good that we couldn't turn you down for lack of a physical deficiency. We withered your arm with gamma radiation. I hope you will forgive us. There was no other way. Of the 86, you are the one that worked. Somehow the combination for you was minutely different from all the other combinations, genetically or environmentally. And it worked. That is all we were after. The mold has been broken. You now know what you are. Let come whatever chaos is to come. The dead hand of the past no longer lies on us. Grayson went to the door and beckoned. 2 captains came in. Steiner broke off his speech as Grayson said to them, "These men deny my godhood. Take them out and—" He finished with a whimsical shrug. "Yes, your divinity," said the captains, without a trace of humor in their voices. End of The Adventurer by C. M. Kornbluth.
How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content.
The Altar at Midnight by C. M. Kornbluth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 4 stories by C. M. Kornbluth. Story 2, The Altar at Midnight. This story was first published in Galaxy Science Fiction, November 1952. He had quite a rum blossom on him for a kid, I thought at first. But when he moved closer to the light by the cash register to ask the bartender for a match or something, I saw it wasn't that. Not just the nose. Broken veins on his cheeks, too. And the funny eyes. He must have seen me look because he slid back away from the light. The bartender shook my bottle of ale in front of me like a Swiss bell ringer, so it foamed inside the green glass. "You ready for another, sir?" he asked. I shook my head. Down the bar he tried it on the kid. He was drinking scotch and water or something like that, and found out he could push him around. He sold him 3 scotch and waters in 10 minutes. When he tried for number 4, the kid had his courage up and said, "I'll tell you when I'm ready for another, Jack." But there wasn't any trouble. It was almost 9, and the place began to fill up. The manager, a real hood type, stationed himself by the door to screen out the high school kids and give the big hello to conventioners. The girls came hurrying in, too, with their little makeup cases and their fancy hair piled up and their frozen faces with the perfect mouths drawn on them. One of them stopped to say something to the manager, some excuse about something, and he said, "That's all right. Get in a dressing room." A 3-piece band behind the drapes at the back of the stage began to make warm-up noises, and there were 2 bartenders keeping busy. Mostly it was beer, a midweek crowd. I finished my ale and had to wait a couple of minutes before I could get another bottle. The bar filled up from the end near the stage because all the customers wanted a good close look at the strippers for their 50-cent bottles of beer. But I noticed that nobody sat down next to the kid, or if anybody did, he didn't stay long. You go out for some fun and the bartender pushes you around and nobody wants to sit next to you. I picked up my bottle and glass and went down on the stool to his left. He turned to me right away and said, "What kind of a place is this, anyway?" The broken veins were all over his face, little ones, but so many, so close that they made his face look something like marbled rubber. The funny look in his eyes was it, the trick contact lenses. But I tried not to stare and not to look away. "It's okay," I said. "It's a good show if you don't mind a lot of noise from—" He stuck a cigarette into his mouth and poked the pack at me. "I'm a spacer," he said, interrupting. I took one of his cigarettes and said, "Oh." He snapped a lighter for the cigarette and said, "Venus." I was noticing that his pack of cigarettes on the bar had some kind of a yellow sticker instead of the blue tax stamp. "Ain't that a crock?" he asked. "You can't smoke, and they give you lighters for a souvenir. But it's a good lighter. On Mars last week they gave us all some cheap pen and pencil sets." "You get something every trip, huh?" I took a good long drink of ale, and he finished his scotch and water. "Shoot. You call a trip a shoot." One of the girls was working her way down the bar. She was going to slide into the empty stool at his right and give him the business, but she looked at him first and decided not to. She curled around me and asked if I'd buy her a little old drink. I said no, and she moved on to the next. I could kind of feel the young man quivering. When I looked at him, he stood up. I followed him out of the dump. The manager grinned without thinking and said, "Good night, boys," to us. The kid stopped in the street and said to me, "You don't have to follow me around, Pappy." He sounded like one wrong word and I would get socked in the teeth. "Take it easy. I know a place where they won't spit in your eye." He pulled himself together and made a joke of it. "This I have to see," he said. "Near here?" "A few blocks." We started walking. It was a nice night. "I don't know this city at all," he said. "I'm from Covington, Kentucky. You do your drinking at home there. We don't have places like this." He meant the whole Skid Row area. "It's not so bad," I said. "I spend a lot of time here." "Is that a fact? I mean, down home, a man your age would likely have a wife and children." "I do. The hell with them." He laughed like a real youngster, and I figured he couldn't even be 25. He didn't have any trouble with the broken curbstones in spite of his scotch and waters. I asked him about it. "Sense of balance," he said. "You have to be tops for balance to be a spacer. You spend so much time outside in a suit. People don't know how much. Punctures, and you aren't worth a damn if you lose your point." "What's that mean?" "Oh, well, it's hard to describe. When you're outside and you lose your point, it means you're all mixed up, and you don't know which way the can, that's the ship, which way the can is. It's having all that room around you, but if you have a good balance, you feel a little tugging to the ship, or maybe you just know which way the ship is without feeling it. Then you have your point, and you can get the work done. There must be a lot that's hard to describe." He thought that might be a crack, and he clammed up on me. "You call this Gandytown," I said after a while. "It's where the stove-up old railroad men hang out. This is the place." It was the second week of the month, before everybody's pension check was all gone. Oswiak's was jumping. The grandsons of the pioneers were on the jute, singing the Man from Mars yodel, and old Paddy Shea was jiggling in the middle of the floor. He had a full seidel of beer in his right hand, and his empty left sleeve was flapping. The kid balked at the screen door. "Too damn bright," he said. I shrugged and went on in, and he followed. We sat down at a table. At Oswiak's, you can drink at the bar if you want to, but none of the regulars do. Paddy jiggled over and said, "Welcome home, Doc." He's a Liverpool Irishman. They talk like Scots, some say, but they sound almost like Brooklyn to me. "Hello, Paddy. I brought somebody uglier than you. Now, what do you say?" Paddy jiggled around the kid in a half-circle with his sleeve flapping, and then flopped into a chair when the record stopped. He took a big drink from the seidel and said, "Can he do this?" Paddy stretched his face into an awful grin that showed his teeth. He had 3 of them. The kid laughed and asked me, "What the hell did you drag me into here for?" "Paddy says he'll buy drinks for the house the day anybody uglier than he is comes in." Oswiak's wife waddled over for the order, and the kid asked us what we'd have. I figured I could start drinking, so it was 3 double scotches. After the second round, Paddy started blowing about how they took his arm off without any anesthetics except a bottle of gin because the red ball freight he was tangled up in couldn't wait. That brought some of the other old gimps over to the table with their stories. Blackie Bauer had been sitting in a boxcar with his leg sticking through the door when the train started with a jerk. Wham! The door closed. Everybody laughed at Blackie for being that dumb in the first place, and he got mad. Sam Fireman has palsy. This week he was claiming he used to be a watchmaker before he began to shake. The week before he said he was a brain surgeon. A woman I didn't know, a real old boxcar Bertha, dragged herself over and began some kind of story about how her sister married a Greek, but she passed out before we found out what happened. Somebody wanted to know what was wrong with the kid's face. Bauer, I think it was, after he came back to the table. "Compression and decompression," the kid said. "You're all the time climbing into your suit and out of your suit. Inboard air's thin to start with. You get a few red lines, that's those ruptured blood vessels, and you say to hell with the money. All you'll make is just one more trip. But, God, it's a lot of money for anybody my age. You keep saying that until you can't be anything but a spacer. The eyes are hard radiation scars." "You like dot all over?" asked Oswiak's wife politely. "All over, ma'am," the kid told her in a miserable voice. "But I'm going to quit before I get a Bowman head." "I don't care," said Maggie Rorty. "I think he's cute." "Compared with—" Patty began, but I kicked him under the table. We sang for a while, and then we told gags and recited limericks for a while, and I noticed that the kid and Maggie had wandered into the back room, the one with the latch on the door. Oswiak's wife asked me, very puzzled, "Doc, why they do that flying by planets?" "It's the damn government," Sam Fireman said. "Why not?" I said. "They got the Bowman Drive. Why the hell shouldn't they use it? Serves them right." I had a double scotch and added, 20 years of it, and they found out a few things they didn't know. Red lines are only one of them. 20 years more, and maybe they'll find out a few more things they didn't know. Maybe by the time there's a bathtub in every American home and an alcoholism clinic in every American town, they'll find out a whole lot of things they didn't know. And every American boy will be a pop-eyed, blood-rattled wreck like our friend here from riding the Bowman Drive. "It's the damn government," Sam Fireman repeated. "And what the hell do you mean by that remark about alcoholism?" Patty said real sore. "Personally, I can take it or leave it alone." So we got to talking about that, and everybody there turned out to be people who could take it or leave it alone. It was maybe midnight when the kid showed at the table again, looking kind of dazed. I was drunker than I ought to be by midnight, so I said I was going for a walk. He tagged along, and we wound up on a bench at Screwball Square. The soap boxers were still going strong. Like I said, it was a nice night. After a while, a pot-bellied old auntie who didn't give a damn about the face sat down and tried to talk the kid into going to see some etchings. The kid didn't get it, and I led him over to hear the soap boxers before there was trouble. One of the orators was a mush-mouthed evangelist. "And oh, my friends," he said, "when I looked through the porthole of the spaceship and beheld the wonder of the firmament—" "You're a stinking Yankee liar," the kid yelled at him. "You say one damn more word about can shooting, and I'll ram your spaceship down your lying throat. Where's your red lines if you're such a hot spacer?" The crowd didn't know what he was talking about, but "where's your red line" sounded good to them, so they heckled Mushmouth off his box with it. I got the kid to a bench. The liquor was working in him all of a sudden. He simmered down after a while and asked, "Doc, should I have given Ms. Rorty some money? I asked her afterward, and she said she'd admire to have something to remember me by, so I gave her my lighter. She seemed to be real pleased with that. But I was wondering if maybe I embarrassed her by asking her right out. Like I told you, back in Covington, Kentucky, we don't have any places like that. Or maybe we did, and I just didn't know about them. But what do you think I should have done about Miss Rorty?" "Just what you did," I told him. "If they want money, they ask for it first. Where are you staying?" "YMCA," he said, almost asleep. "Back in Covington, Kentucky, I was a member of the Y, and I kept up my membership. They have to let me in because I'm a member. Spacers have all kind of trouble, Doc. Woman trouble, hotel trouble, family trouble, religious trouble. I was raised a Southern Baptist, but where's heaven anyway? I asked Dr. Chitwood last time home before the red lines got so thick, Doc, you aren't a minister of the gospel, are you? I hope I didn't say anything to offend you. No offense, son, I said. No offense. I walked him to the avenue and waited for a fleet cab. It was almost 5 minutes. The independents that roll drunks dent the fenders of fleet cabs if they show up in Skid Row, and then the fleet drivers have to make reports on their own time to the company. It keeps them away. But I got one and dumped the kid in. The Y Hotel, I told the driver. Here's $5. Help him in when you get there. When I walked through Screwball Square again, some college kids were yelling, "Where's your red lines?" at old Charlie, the last of the Wobblies. Old Charlie kept roaring, "The hell with your bread lines. I'm talking about atomic bombs, right up there." And he pointed at the moon. It was a nice night, but the liquor was dying in me. There was a joint around the corner, so I went in and had a drink to carry me to the club. I had a bottle there. I got into the first cab that came. "Athletic club," I said. "In a doghouse, huh?" the driver said, and he gave me a big personality smile. I didn't say anything, and he started the car. He was right, of course. I was in everybody's doghouse. Some day I'd scare the hell out of time and lies by going home and showing them what their daddy looked like. Down at the Institute, I was in the doghouse. "Oh, dear," everybody at the Institute said to everybody. "I'm sure I don't know what ails the man. A lovely wife and 2 lovely grown children, and she has to tell him either you go or I go. And drinking. And this is rather subtle, but it's a well-known fact that neurotics seek out low company to compensate for their guilt feelings. The places he frequents. Dr. Francis Bowman, the man who made spaceflight a reality, the man who put the bomb base on the moon. Really, I'm sure I don't know what ails him." The hell with them all. End of The Altar at Midnight by C. M. Kornbluth. With These Hands by C. M. Kornbluth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 4 Science Fiction Stories by C. M. Kornbluth. Story number 3, With These Hands. The story was first published in Galaxy Science Fiction, December 1951. Halverson waited in the Chancery office while Monsignor Reedy disposed of 3 persons who had preceded him. He was a little dizzy with hunger, and noticed only vaguely that the prelate's secretary was beckoning to him. He started to his feet when the secretary pointedly opened the door to Monsignor Reedy's inner office and stood waiting beside it. The artist crossed the floor, forgetting that he had leaned his portfolio against his chair, remembered at the door, and went back for it, flushing. The secretary looked patient. "Thanks," Halverson murmured to him as the door closed. There was something wrong with the prelate's manner. "I've brought the designs for the stations, Padre," he said, opening the portfolio on the desk. "Bad news, Rold," said the Monsignor. "I know how you've been looking forward to the commission." "Somebody else get it?" asked the artist faintly, leaning against the desk. "I thought His Eminence definitely decided I had the—" "It's not that," said the Monsignor. "But the Sacred Congregation of Rites this week made a pronouncement on images of devotion. Stereopantograph is to be listed within a diocese at the discretion of the bishop, and His Eminence—" "SPG, slimy imitations," protested Halverson. "Real as a plastic eye. No texture, no guts. You know that, Padre," he said accusingly. "I'm sorry, Rold," said the Monsignor. "Your work is better than we'll get from a stereopantograph, to my eyes at least. But there are other considerations." "Money," spat the artist. "Yes, money," the prelate admitted. "His Eminence wants to see the St. Xavier U building program through before he dies. Is that a mortal sin? And there are our schools, our charities, our Venus mission. SPG will mean a considerable savings on procurement and maintenance of devotional images. Even if I could, I would not disagree with His Eminence on adopting it as a matter of diocesan policy. The prelate's eye fell on the detailed drawings of the Stations of the Cross and lingered. "Your Saint Veronica," he said abstractedly. "Very fine. It suggests one of Caravaggio's careworn saints to me. I would have liked to see her in bronze." "So would I," said Halverson hoarsely. "Keep the drawings, Padre." He started for the door. "But I can't—" "That's all right." The artist walked past the secretary and out of the chancery into Fifth Avenue's spring sunlight. He hoped Monsignor Reedy was enjoying the drawings and was ashamed of himself and sorry for Halverson. And he was glad he didn't have to carry the heavy portfolio anymore. Everything seemed so heavy lately. Chisels, hammer, wooden pallet. Maybe the Padre would send him something and pretend it was for expenses or an advance, as he had in the past. Halverson's feet carried him up the avenue. No, there wouldn't be any advances any more. The last steady trickle of income had just been dried up. By an announcement in Observatore Romano, religious conservatism had carried the church as far as it would go in its ancient role of art patron. When all Europe was writing on the wonderful new vellum, the church stuck to good old papyrus. When all Europe was writing on the wonderful new paper, the church stuck to good old vellum. When all architects and municipal monument committees and portrait bust clients were patronizing the stereopantograph, the church stuck to good old expensive sculpture. But not any more. He was passing an SPG salon now where one of his Tuesday night pupils worked, one of the few men in the classes. Mostly they consisted of lazy, moody, irritable girls. Halverson, surprised at himself, entered the salon, walking between aesthetic semi-nude stereos executed in transparent plastic that made the skin of his neck and shoulders prickle with goose flesh. Slime, he thought. How can they— May I help? Oh, hello, Rold. What brings you here? He knew suddenly what had brought him there. Could you make a little advance on next month's tuition, Louis? I'm strapped. He took a nervous look around the chamber of horrors, avoiding the man's condescending face. I guess so, Rold. Would $10 be any help? That'll carry us through the 25th, right? Fine, right, sure, he said, while he was being unwillingly towed around the place. I know you don't think much of SPG, but it's quiet now, so this is a good chance to see how we work. I don't say it's art with a capital A, but you've got to admit it's an art, something people like at a price they can afford to pay. Here's where we set them. Then you run out the feelers to reference points on the face. You know what they are? He heard himself say dryly, I know what they are. The Egyptian sculptors used them when they carved statues of the pharaohs. Yes, I never knew that. There's nothing new under the sun, is there? But this is the heart of the SPG. The youngster proudly swung open the door of an electric device in the wall of the portrait booth. Tubes winked sullenly at Halverson. The aestheticon? He asked indifferently. He did not feel indifferent, but it would be absurd to show anger, no matter how much he felt it, against a mindless aggregation of circuits that could calculate layouts, criticize and correct pictures for a desired effect, and that had put the artist of design out of a job. Yes, the lenses take 16 profiles, you know, and we set the aestheticon for whatever we want, cute, rugged, sexy, spiritual, brainy, or a combination. It fares curves from profile to profile to give us just what we want, distorts the profiles themselves within limits if it has to, and there's your portrait stored in the memory tank, waiting to be taped. You set your ratio for any enlargement or reduction you want and play it back. I wish we were reproducing today. It's fascinating to watch. You just pour in your cold-set plastic, the nozzles ooze out a core and start crawling over to scan, a drop here, a worm there, and it begins to take shape. We mostly do portrait busts here, the Avenue trade, but Wilgus the foreman used to work in a monument shop in Brooklyn. He did that heroic-size war memorial on the East River Drive, hired Garda Bouchette, the TV girl, for the central figure. And what a figure! He told me he set the aestheticon plates for 3/4 sexy, 1/4 spiritual. Here's something interesting. Standing figurine of Orrin Ryerson, the banker. He ordered 12. Figurines are coming in. The girls like them because they can show their shapes. You'd be surprised at some of the poses they want to try. Somehow, Halverson got out with the $10, walked to 6th Avenue, and sat down hard in a cheap restaurant. He had coffee and dozed a little, waking with a guilty start at a racket across the street. There was a building going up. For a while he watched the great machines pour walls and floors, the workmen rolling here and there on their little chariots to weld on a wall panel, stripe on an electric circuit of conductive ink, or spray plastic finish over the wired wall, all without leaving the saddles of their little mechanical chariots. Halverson felt more determined. He bought a paper from a vending machine by the restaurant door, drew another cup of coffee, and turned to the help-wanted ads. The tricky trade school ads urged him to learn construction work and make big money. Be a plumbing machine setup man. Be a house wiring machine tender. Be a servo truck driver. Be a lumber stacker operator. Learn pouring machine maintenance. Make big money. A sort of panic overcame him. He ran to the phone booth and dialed a Passaic number. He heard the ring, 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 and strained to hear old Mr. Krebel's stumping footsteps growing louder as he neared the phone, even though he knew he would hear nothing until the receiver was picked up. Ring, ring, ring. "Hello?" grunted the old man's voice, and his face appeared on the little screen. "Hello, Mr. Halverson. What can I do for you?" Halverson was tongue-tied. He couldn't possibly say, "I just wanted to see if you were still there. I was afraid you weren't there anymore." He choked and improvised. "Hello, Mr. Krebel. It's about the banister on the stairs in my place. I noticed it's pretty shaky. Could you come over sometime and fix it for me?" Krebel peered suspiciously out of the screen. "I could do that," he said slowly. "I don't have much work nowadays, but you can carpenter as good as me, Mr. Halverson. And frankly, you're very slow pay, and I like cabinet work better. I'm not a young man, and climbing around on ladders takes it out of me. If you can't find anybody else, I'll take the work. But I got to have some of the money first, just for the materials. It isn't easy to get good wood anymore." "All right," said Halverson. Thanks, Mr. Krebel. I'll call you if I can't get anybody else." He hung up and went back to his table and newspaper. His face was burning with anger at the old man's reluctance and his own foolish panic. Krebel didn't realize they were both in the same leaky boat. Krebel, who didn't get a job in a month, still thought with senile pride that he was a journeyman carpenter and cabinet maker who could make his solid way anywhere with his toolbox and his skill, and that he could afford to look down on anything as disreputable as an artist, even an artist who could carpenter as well as he did himself. Labouère had made Halverson learn carpentry, and Labouère had been right. You built a scaffold so you could sculpt up high, not so it will collapse and you break a leg. You build your platform so they hold the rock steady, not so it wobbles and chatters at every blow of the chisel. You build your armatures so they hold the plasticine you slam into them. But the help-wanted ads wanted no builders of scaffolds, platforms, and armatures. The factories were calling for setup men and maintenance men for the production and assembly machines. From upstate, General Vegetables had sent a recruiting team for farm help, harvest setup and maintenance men, A few openings for experienced operators of tank-caulking machinery. Under office and personnel, the demand was heavy for computer men, for girls who could run the IBM letter writer, especially familiar sales and collections correspondents, for office machinery maintenance and repairmen. A job printing house wanted an aestheticon operator for letterhead layouts and the like. AT&T wanted trainees to earn while learning telephone maintenance. A direct mail advertising outfit wanted an artist. No, they wanted a sales executive who could scrawl picture ideas that would be subjected to the criticism and correction of the aestheticon. Halverson leafed tiredly through the rest of the paper. He knew he wouldn't get a job, and if he did, he wouldn't hold it. He knew it was a terrible thing to admit to yourself that you might starve to death because you were bored by anything except art, but he admitted it. It had happened often enough in the past. Artists undergoing preposterous hardships, not, as people thought, because they were devoted to art, but because nothing else was interesting. If there were only some impressive, sonorous word that summed up the aching, oppressive futility that overcame him when he tried to get out of art, only there wasn't. He thought he could tell which of the photos in the tabloid had been corrected by the aestheticon. There was a shot of Jink Bitsy, who was to star in a remake of Peter Pan. Her ears had been made to look not pointed, but pointy. Her upper lip had been lengthened a trifle, her nose had been pugged a little, and tilted quite a lot. Her freckles were cuter than cute, her brows were innocently arched, and her lower lip and eyes were nothing less than pornography. There was a shot, apparently uncorrected, of the last Venus ship coming in at LaGuardia, and the average-looking explorers grinning. Caption: Austin Malone and crew smile relief on safe arrival. Malone says Venus colonies need men machines. See story, page 2. Petulantly, Halverson threw the paper under the table and walked out. What had space travel to do with him? Vacations on the moon and expeditions to Venus and Mars were part of the deadly encroachment on his livelihood and no more. End of Part 1. Part 2. He took the subway to Passaic and walked down a long, still travel beltway to his studio, almost the only building alive in the slums near the rusting railroad freight yard. A sign that had once said, F. Laboire, Sculptor, Portraits and Architectural Commissions, now said, Roald Halverson, Art Classes, Reasonable Fees. It was a grimy two-story frame building with a shop front in which were mounted some of his students' charcoal figure studies and oil still lifes. He lived upstairs, taught downstairs front, and did his own work downstairs back behind dirty ceiling-high drapes. Going in, he noticed that he had forgotten to lock the door again. He slammed it bitterly. At the noise, somebody called from behind the drapes. "Who's that?" "Halverson," he yelled in a sudden fury. "I live here. I own this place. Come out of there. What do you want?" There was a fumbling at the drapes, and a girl stepped between them, shrinking from their dirt. "Your door was open," she said firmly, "and it's a shop. I've been here a couple of minutes. I came to ask about classes, but I don't think I'm interested if you're this bad-tempered." A pupil. Pupils were never to be abused, especially not now. "I'm terribly sorry," he said. "I had a trying day in the city." Now turn it on. "I wouldn't tell everybody a terrible secret like this, but I've lost a commission. You understand?" "I thought so. Anybody who traipsed out here to my dingy abode would be simpatica. Won't you sit down? No, not there. Humor an artist and sit over there. The warm background of that still life brings out your color. Quite good color. Have you ever been painted? You've a very interesting face, you know. Someday I'd like to... But you mentioned classes. We have figure classes, male and female models alternating on Tuesday nights. For that I have to be very stern and ask you to sign up for an entire course of 12 lessons at $60. It's the model's fees. They're exorbitant. Saturday afternoons we have still life classes for beginners in oils. That's only $2 a class, but you might sign up for a series of 6 and pay $10 in advance, which saves you 2 whole dollars. I also give private instructions to a few talented amateurs. The price was open on that one, whatever the traffic would bear. It had been a year since he'd had a private pupil, and she'd taken only 6 lessons at $5 an hour. "The still life sounds interesting," said the girl, holding her head self-consciously, the way they all did when he gave them the patter. It was a good head, carried well up. The muscles clung close, not yet slackened into geotropic loops and lumps. The line of youth is heliotropic, he confusedly thought. "I saw some interesting things back there. Was that your own work?" She rose, obviously with the expectation of being taken into the studio. Her body was one of those long-lined, small-breasted, coltish jobs that the pre-Raphaelites loved to draw. "Well," said Halverson. A deliberate show of reluctance, then a bright smile of confidence. "You'll understand," he said positively, and drew aside the curtains. What a curious place! She wandered about, inspecting the drums of plaster, clay, and plasticine, the rack of tools, the stands, the stones, the chisels, the forge, the kiln, the lumber, the glaze bench. "I like this," she said determinedly, picking up a figure a half-meter tall, a Venus he had cast in bronze while studying under La Beauvoir some years ago. "How much is it?" An honest answer would scare her off, and there was no chance in the world that she'd buy. "I hardly ever put my things up for sale," he told her lightly. "That was just a little study. I do work on commission only nowadays." Her eyes flicked about the dingy room, seeming to take in its scaling plaster and warped floor, and see through the wall to the abandoned slum in which it was set. There was amusement in her glance. "I am not being honest, she thinks. She thinks that is funny. Very well, I will be honest. $600, he said flatly. The girl set the figurine on its stand with a rap and said, half angry and half amused, "I don't understand it. That's more than a month's pay for me. I could get an SPG statuette just as pretty as this for $10. Who do you artists think you are, anyway?" Halverson debated with himself about what he could say in reply. An SPG operator spends a week learning his skill, and I spend a lifetime learning mine. An SPG operator makes a mechanical copy of a human form distorted by formula mechanically arrived at from psychotests of population samples. I take full responsibility for my work. It is mine, though I use what I see fit from Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Augustan and Romantic and modern eras. An SPG operator works in soft, homogeneous plastic. I work in bronze that is more complicated than you dream, that is cast and acid dipped today, so it will slowly take on rich and subtle coloring many years from today. An SPG operator could not make an Orpheus fountain. He mumbled Orpheus and keeled over. Halverson awoke in his bed on the second floor of the building. His fingers and toes buzzed electrically, and he felt very clear-headed. The girl and a man, unmistakably a doctor, were watching him. "You don't seem to belong to any medical plans, Halverson," the doctor said irritably. "There weren't any cards on you at all. No red, no blue, no green, no brown." "I used to be on the green plan, but I've let it lapse," the artist said defensively. "And look what happened." "Stop nagging him," the girl said. "I'll pay you your fee." "It's supposed to come through a plan," the doctor fretted. "We won't tell anybody," the girl promised. "Here's $5. Just stop nagging him." "Malnutrition," said the doctor. "Normally I'd send him to a hospital, but I don't see how I could manage it. He isn't on any plan at all. Look, I'll take the money and leave some vitamins. That's what he needs, vitamins and food." "I'll see that he eats," the girl said, and the doctor left. "How long since you've had anything?" she asked Halverson. "I had some coffee today," he answered, thinking back. "I've been working on detailed drawings for a commission, and it fell through. I told you that. It was a shock." "I'm Lucretia Grumman," she said, and went out. He dozed until she came back with an armful of groceries. "It's hard to get around down here," she complained. "It was Laboeur's studio," he told her defiantly. "He left it to me when he died. Things weren't so run down in his time. I studied under him. He was one of the last. He had a joke. They don't really want my stuff, but they're ashamed to let me starve. He warned me that they wouldn't be ashamed to let me starve, but I insisted and he took me in." Halverson drank some milk and ate some bread. He thought of the change from the $10 in his pocket and decided not to mention it. Then he remembered that the doctor had gone through his pockets. "I can pay you for this," he said. "It's very kind of you, but you mustn't think I'm pitiless. I've just been too preoccupied to take care of myself." "Sure," said the girl, "but we can call this an advance. I want to sign up for some classes." "Be happy to have you." "Am I bothering you?" asked the girl. "You said something odd when you fainted. Orpheus. Did I say that?" "I must have been thinking of Miles's Orpheus Fountain in Copenhagen. I've seen photos, but I've never been there." "Germany? But there's nothing left of Germany." "Copenhagen's in Denmark. There's quite a lot of Denmark left. It was only on the fringes, heavily radiated, but still there." "I want to travel too," she said. "I work at LaGuardia, and I've never been off except for an orbiting excursion. I want to go to the moon on my vacation. They give us a bonus in travel vouchers. It must be wonderful dancing under the low gravity." "Spaceport? Off? Low gravity?" Terms belonging to the detested electronic whirl of the stereopantograph, in which he had no place. "Be very interesting," he said, closing his eyes to conceal disgust. "I am bothering you. I'll go away now, but I'll be back Tuesday night for the class. What time do I come, and what should I bring?" 8. It's charcoal. I sell you the sticks and paper. Just bring a smock." "All right. And I want to take the oils class, too. And I want to bring some people I know to see your work. I'm sure they'll see something they like. Austin Malone's in from Venus. He's a special friend of mine." "Lucretia," he said. "Or do some people call you Lucy?" "Lucy." "Will you take that little bronze you liked as a thank you?" "I can't do that." "Please, I'd feel much better about this. I really mean it." She nodded abruptly, flushing, and almost ran from the room. Now, why did I do that? He asked himself. He hoped it was because he liked Lucy Grumman very much. He hoped it wasn't a cold-blooded investment of a piece of sculpture that would never be sold anyway, just to make sure she'd be back with class fees and more groceries. End of Part 2. Part 3. She was back on Tuesday, a half-hour early, and carrying a smock. He introduced her formally to the others as they arrived, a dozen or so bored young women, who, he suspected, talked a great deal about their art lessons outside, but in class used any excuse to stop sketching. He didn't dare show Lucy any particular consideration. There were fierce little miniature cliques in the class. Halverson knew they laughed at him and his line among themselves, and yet, strangely, were fiercely jealous of their seniority and right to individual attention. The lesson was an ordeal, as usual. The model, a muscle-bound young graduate of the barbell gyms and figure photography studios, was stupid and argumentative about 10-minute poses. Two of the girls came near a hair-pulling brawl over the rights to a preferred sketching location. A third girl had discovered Picasso's Cubist period during the past week and proudly announced that she didn't feel perspective in art. But the 2 interminable hours finally ticked by. He nagged them into clearing up, not as bad as the Saturday with oils, and stood by the open door. Otherwise they would have stayed all night, cackling about absent students and snarling sulkily among themselves. His well-laid plans went sour, though. A large and flashy car drove up as the girls were leaving. "That's Austin Malone," said Lucy. "He came to pick me up and look at your work." That was all the wedge her fellow pupils needed. "Austin Malone? Well, Lucy, darling, I'd love to meet a real spaceman. Roll, darling, would you mind very much if I stayed a moment? I'm certainly not going to miss this, and I don't care if you mind or not. Roll, darling." Malone was an impressive figure. Halverson thought, "He looks as though he's been run through an aestheticon set for brawny and determined." Lucy made a hash of the introductions, and the spaceman didn't rise to the conversational bait dangled enticingly by the girls. In a clear voice, he said to Halverson, "I don't want to take up too much of your time. Lucy tells me you have some things for sale. Is there any place we can look at them where it's quiet?" The students made sulky exits. "Back here," said the artist. The girl and Malone followed him through the curtains. The spaceman made a slow circuit of the studio, seeming to repel questions. He sat down at last and said, "I don't know what to think, Halverson. This place stuns me. Do you know you're in the Dark Ages?" People who never have given a thought to Chartres and Mont Saint-Michel usually call it the Dark Ages, Halverson thought wryly. He asked, "Technologically, you mean?" "No, not at all. My plaster's better, my colors are better, my metal is better. Tool metal, not casting metal, that is." "I mean hand work," said the spaceman. "Actually working by hand." The artist shrugged. "There have been crazes for the technique of the boiler works in the machine shop," he admitted. "Some interesting things were done, but they didn't stand up well. Is there anything here that takes your eye?" "I like those dolphins," said the spaceman, pointing to a perforated terracotta relief on the wall. They had been commissioned by an architect, then later refused for reasons of economy when the house had run way over estimate. "They'd look bully over the fireplace in my town apartment. Like them, Lucy?" "I think they're wonderful," said the girl. Roald saw the spaceman go rigid with the effort not to turn and stare at her. He loved her, and he was jealous. Roald told the story of the dolphins and said, the price that the architect thought was too high was $360. Malone grunted. "Doesn't seem unreasonable, if you set a high store on inspiration." "I don't know about inspiration," the artist said evenly, "but I was awake for 2 days and 2 nights shoveling coal and adjusting drafts to fire that thing in my kiln." The spaceman looked contemptuous. "I'll take it," he said. "Be something to talk about during those awkward pauses. Tell me, Halverson, how's Lucy's work? Do you think she ought to stick with it?" "Austin," objected the girl, "don't be so blunt. How can he possibly know after 1 day?" "She can't draw yet," the artist said cautiously. "It's all coordination, you know, thousands of hours of practice, training your eye and hand to work together until you can put a line on paper where you want it. Lucy, if you're really interested in it, you'll learn to draw well. I don't think any of the other students will. They're in it because of boredom or snobbery, and they'll stop before they have their eye-hand coordination." "I am interested," she said firmly. Malone's determined restraint broke. "Damn right you are. He recovered himself and demanded of Halverson, "I understand your point about coordination, but thousands of hours when you can buy a camera? It's absurd." I was talking about drawing, not art, replied Halverson. Drawing is putting a line on paper where you want it, I said. He took a deep breath and hoped the great distinction wouldn't sound ludicrous and trivial. So let's say that art is knowing how to put the line in the right place. Be practical. There isn't any art. Not anymore. I get around quite a bit, and I never see anything but photos and SPGs. A few heirlooms, yes, but nobody's painting or carving anymore. There's some art, Malone. My students, a couple of them in the still life class, are quite good. There are more across the country. Art for occupational therapy or a hobby or something to do with the hands. There's trade in their work. They sell them to each other. They give them to their friends. They hang them on their walls. There are even some sculptors like that. Sculpture is prescribed by doctors. The occupational therapists say it's even better than drawing and painting, so some of these people work in plasticine and soft stone, and some of them get to be good. Maybe so. I'm an engineer, Halverson. We glory in doing things the easy way. Doing things the easy way got me to Mars and Venus, and it's going to get me to Ganymede. You're doing things the hard way, and your inefficiency has no place in this world. Look at you. You've lost a fingertip. Some accident, I suppose? I never noticed, said Lucy, then let out a faint, "Oh." Halverson curled the middle finger of his left hand into the palm, where he usually carried it to hide the missing first joint. "Yes," he said softly, "an accident." "Accidents are a sign of inadequate mastery of material and equipment," said Malone sententiously. "While you stick to your methods and I stick to mine, you can't compete with me." His tone made it clear that he was talking about more than engineering. "Shall we go now, Lucy? Here's my card, Halverson. Send those dolphins along and I'll mail you a check." End of Part 3. Part 4. The artist walked the half-dozen blocks to Mr. Kriebel's place the next day. He found the old man in the basement shop of his fussy house, hunched over his bench with a powerful light overhead. He was trying to file a saw. "Mr. Kriebel," Halverson called over the shriek of metal. The carpenter turned around and peered with watery eyes. "I can't see like I used to," he said querulously. "I go over the same teeth on this damn saw. I skip teeth. I can't see the light shine off it when I got one set. The glare." He banged down his three-cornered file petulantly. "Well, what can I do for you?" "I need some crating stock. Anything. I'll trade you a couple of my maple 4x4s. The old face became cunning. "And will you set my saw? My saws, I mean? It's nothing to you, an hour's work. You have the eyes." Halverson said bitterly, "All right." The old man had to drive his bargain, even though he might never use his saws again. And then the artist promptly repented of his bitterness, offering up a quick prayer that his own failure to conform didn't make him as much of a nuisance to the world as Kriebel was. The carpenter was pleased as they went through his small stock of wood and chose boards to crate the dolphin relief. He was pleased enough to give Halverson coffee and cake before the artist buckled down to filing his saws. Over the kitchen table, Halverson tried to probe. "Things pretty slow now?" It would be hard to spoil Kriebel's day now. "People are always fools. They don't know good handwork. Some day," he said apocalyptically, "I laugh on the other side of my face when their foolish machine buildings go falling down in a strong wind, all of them, all over the country. Even my boy, I used to beat him good almost every day. He works a foolish concrete machine, and his house should fall on his head like the rest." Halverson knew it was Kriebel's son who supported him by mail, and changed the subject. "You get some cabinet work?" "Stupid women. What they call antiques, they don't know Meissen, they don't know Biedermeier. They bring me trash to repair sometimes. I make them pay. I swindle them good. I wonder if things would be different if there were anything left over in Europe. People will still be fools, Mr. Halverson, said the carpenter positively. Didn't you say you were going to file those saws today? So the artist spent 2 noisy hours filing before he carried his crating stock to the studio. Lucy was there. She had brought some things to eat. He dumped the lumber with a bang and demanded, "Why aren't you at work?" "We get days off," she said vaguely. "Austin thought he'd give me the cash for the terracotta and I could give it to you." She held out an envelope while he studied her silently. The farce was beginning again, but this time he dreaded it. It would not be the first time that a lonesome, discontented girl chose to see him as a combination of romantic rebel and lost pup, with the consequences you'd expect. He knew from books, experience, and Labour's conversation in the old days that there was nothing novel about the comedy, that there had even been artists, lots of them, who had counted on an endless repetition of it for their livelihood. The girl drops in with the groceries and the artist is pleasantly surprised. The girl admires this little thing or that after payday and buys it, and the artist is pleasantly surprised. The girl brings her friends to take lessons or makes little purchases, and the artist is pleasantly surprised. The girl may be seduced by the artist or vice versa, which shortens the comedy, or they get married, which lengthens it somewhat. It had been 3 years since Halverson had last played out the farce with a manic-depressive divorcee from Elmira. 3 years during which he had crossed the midpoint between 30 and 40. 3 more years to get beaten down by being unwanted and working too much and eating too little. Also, he knew he was in love with this girl. He took the envelope, counted $320, and crammed it into his pocket. "That was your idea," he said. "Thanks. Now get out, will you? I've got work to do." She stood there, shocked. "I said get out. I have work to do." Austin was right, she told him miserably. "You don't care how people feel. You just want to get things out of them." She ran from the studio, and Halverson fought with himself not to run after her. He walked slowly into his workshop and studied his array of tools, though he paid little attention to his finished pieces. It would be nice to spend about half of this money on open hearth steel rod and bar stock to forge into chisels. He thought he knew where he could get some, but she would be back, or he would break and go to her and be forgiven, and the comedy would be played out after all. He couldn't let that happen. End of Part 4. Part 5. Alesund, on the Atlantic side of the Darfjell Mountains of Norway, was in the lee of the blasted continent. One more archaeologist there made no difference, as long as he had the sense to recognize the propeller-like international signpost that said with their 3 blades, "Radiation Hazard," and knew what every schoolboy knew about protective clothing and reading a personal Geiger counter. The car Halverson rented was for a brief trip over the mountains to study contaminated Oslo. Well muffled, he could make it and back in a dozen hours and no harm done. But he took the car past Oslo, Winterberg, and Gothenburg, along the Kattegat coast to Helsingborg, and abandoned it there among the 3-bladed polyglot signs, crossing to Denmark. Danes were as unlike Prussians as they could be, but their unfortunate little peninsula was a sprout off Prussia, which radio cobalt dust couldn't tell from the real thing. The 3-bladed signs were most specific. With a long way to walk among the rubble-littered highways, he stripped off the impregnated coveralls and boots. He had long since shed the noisy counter and the uncomfortable gloves and mask. The silence was eerie as he limped into Copenhagen at noon. He didn't know whether the radiation was getting to him or whether he was tired and hungry and no more. As though thinking of a stranger, he liked what he was doing. "I'll be my own audience," he thought. "God knows I learned there isn't any other, not any more. You have to know when to stop. Rodin, the dirty old wonderful old man, knew that. He taught us not to slick it and polish it and smooth it until it looked like a liquid instead of bronze and stone. Van Gogh was crazy as a loon, but he knew when to stop and varnish it. He didn't care if the paint looked like paint instead of looking like sunset clouds or moonbeams. Up in Hartford, Brown and Sharp stop when they've got a turret lathe. They don't put caryatids on it. I'll stop while my life is a life, before it becomes a thing with distracting embellishments, such as a wife who will come to despise me, a succession of gradually less worthwhile pieces that nobody will look at. Blame nobody, he told himself lightheartedly. And then it was in front of him, terminating a vista of weeds and bomb rubble, Miles's Orpheus Fountain. It took a man, he thought. Aestheticon circuits couldn't do it. There was a gross mixture of styles, a calculated flaw that the Aestheticon couldn't be set to make. Orpheus and the Souls were classic, or later, the three-headed dog was archaic. That was to tell you about the antiquity and invincibility of hell, and that Cerberus knows Orpheus will never go back into life with his bride. There was the heroic, tragic central figure that looked mighty enough to battle with the gods. But battle wasn't any good against the grinning, knowing, hateful, three-headed dog it stood on. You don't battle the pavement when you walk, or the floor of the house you're in. You can't. So Orpheus, his face a mask of controlled and suffering fury, crashes a great chord from his lyre that moved trees and stones. Around him, the naked souls in hell start at the chord, each in his own way. The young lovers down in death, the mother down in death, the musician deaf and down in death, straining to hear. Calverson walked uncertainly toward the fountain, felt something break inside him, and a heaviness in his lungs. As he pitched forward among the weeds, he thought he heard the chord from the lyre, and didn't care that the three-headed dog was grinning its knowing, hateful grin down at him. End of Part 5. Part 6. When Halverson awoke, he supposed he was in hell. There were the young lovers, arms about each other's waists, solemnly looking down at him, and the mother was placidly smoothing his brow. He stirred and felt his left arm fall heavily. "Ah," said the mother, "you mustn't." He felt her pick up his limp arm and lay it across his chest. "Your poor finger," she sighed. "Can you talk? What happened to it?" He could talk weakly. "Labouere and I," he said, "we were moving a big block of marble with the crane. Somehow the finger got under it. I didn't notice until it was too late to shift my grip without the marble slipping and smashing on the floor." The boy said in a solemn, adolescent croak, "You mean you saved the marble and lost your finger?" "Marble," he muttered. "It's so hard to get. Labouere was so old." The young lovers exchanged a glance, and he slept again. He was half awake when the musician seized first one of his hands and then the other, jabbing them with stubby fingers and bending his lion's head close to peer at the horny calluses left by chisel and mallet. "Ya, ya," the musician kept saying. Hell goes on forever. So for an eternity he jolted and jarred, and for an eternity he heard bickering voices. Why, he was so foolish then. A idiot he could be. Hush, let him rest. The children told the story. There only one Labouere was. Easy with the rubbing. Easy with the tubing. Let him rest. Daylight dazzled his eyes. "Why were you so foolish?" demanded a harsh voice. "The sister says I can talk to you now, so that is what I first want to know." He looked at the face of, not the musician, that had been delirium, but it was a tough old face. "Yeah, I am mean-looking, that is settled. What did you think you were doing without overalls and way over your exposure time?" "I wanted to die," said Halverson. There were tubes sticking in his arms. The crag-faced old man let out a contemptuous bellow. "Sister," he shouted, "pull the plasma tubes out before more we waste. He says he wants to die." "Hush," said the nurse. She laid her hand on his brow again. "Don't bother with him, sister," the old man jeered. "He is a shrinking little flower, too delicate for the great rough world. He has done nothing, he can do nothing, so he decides to make himself a nuisance by dying." "You lie," said Halverson. "I worked. Good God, how I worked! Nobody wanted my work. They wanted me to wear in their buttonholes like a flower. They were getting to me. Another year and I wouldn't have been an artist any more." "Yeah?" asked the old man. "Tell me about it." Halverson told him, sometimes weeping with self-pity and weakness, sometimes cursing the old man for not letting him die, sometimes quietly describing this statuette or that portrait head, or raving wildly against the mad folly of the world. At last he told the old man about Lucy. "You cannot have everything, you know," said his listener. "I can have her," answered the artist harshly. "You wouldn't let me die, so I won't die. I'll go back and I'll take her away from that fat head Malone that she ought to marry. I'll give her a couple of happy years working herself to skin and bones for me before she begins to hate it, before I begin to hate it." "You can't go back," said the old man. "I'm Cerberus. Do you understand that? The girl is nothing. The society you come from is nothing. We have a place here. Sister, can he sit up?" The woman smiled and cranked his bed. Halverson saw through a picture window that he was in a mountain-rimmed valley that was very green and dotted with herds and unpainted houses. "Such a place there had to be," said the old man. "In the whole geography of Europe there had to be a Soltau Valley with winds and terrain just right to deflect the dust." "Nobody knows?" whispered the artist. "We prefer it that way. It's impossible to get some things, but you would be surprised how little difference it makes to the young people. They are great travelers, the young people, in their sweaty coveralls with radiation meters. They think when they see the ruined cities that the people who lived in them must have been mad. It was a little travel party like that which found you. The boy was impressed by something you said. I saw some interesting things in your hands. There isn't much rock around here. We have fine, deep topsoil. But the boys could get you stone. There should be a statue of the mayor, for one thing, before I die. And from the Rothaus the wooden angels have mostly broken off. Soltau Valley used to be proud of them. Could you make good copies? And of course, cameras are useless, and the best drawings we can do look funny. Could you teach the youngsters at least to draw so faces look like faces and not behinds? And like you were saying about you and Labouère, maybe one younger there will be so crazy that he will want to learn it all. So Soltau will always have an artist and sculptor for the necessary work, and you will find a Lucy or somebody better. I think better." "Hush," warned the nurse. "You're exciting the patient." "It's all right," said Halverson eagerly. "Thanks, but it's really all right." End of With These Hands by C. M. Kornbluth. The Marching Morons by C. M. Kornbluth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 4 science fiction stories by Cyril M. Kornbluth. Story 4, The Marching Morons. The story was first published in Galaxy Science Fiction, April 1951. Some things had not changed. A potter's wheel was still a potter's wheel, and clay was still clay. F.M. Hawkins had to build his shop near Goose Lake, which had a narrow band of good fat clay and a narrow beach of white sand. He fired 3 bottle-nosed kilns with yellow charcoal from the woodlot. The woodlot was also useful for long walks while the kilns were cooling. If he let himself stay within sight of them, he would open them prematurely, impatient to see how some new shape or glaze had come through the fire, and ping! The new shape or glaze would be good for nothing but the shard pile back of his slip tanks. A business conference was in full swing in his shop, a modest cube of brick tile-roofed as the Chicago-Los Angeles rocket thundered overhead, very noisy, very swept back, very fiery jets, shaped as sleekly swift-looking as an airborne barracuda. The buyer from Marshall Fields was turning over a black-glazed 1-liter carafe, nodding approval with his massive, handsome head. "This is real pretty," he told Hawkins and his own secretary, Gomez Laplace. "This has got lots of what you call real aesthetic principles. Yeah, it is real pretty." "How much?" the secretary asked the potter. $7.50 each in dozen lots, said Hawkins. "I ran up 15 dozen last month." "They are real aesthetic," repeated the buyer from Fields. "I will take them all." "I don't think we can do that, Doctor," said the secretary. "They cost us $1,350. That would leave only $532 in our quarter's budget, and we still have to run down to East Liverpool to pick up some cheap dinner sets." "Dinner sets?" asked the buyer, his big face full of wonder. "Dinner sets. The department's been out of them for 2 months now. Mr. Garvey Seabright got pretty nasty about it yesterday, remember?" "Garvey Seabright, that meat-headed blue-nose," the buyer said contemptuously. "He don't know nothing about aesthetics. Why for don't he let me run my own department?" His eye fell on a stray copy of Wambo-Zambo comics, and he sat down with it. An occasional deep chuckle or grunt of surprise escaped him as he turned the pages. Uninterrupted, the potter and the buyer's secretary quickly closed the deal for 2 dozen of the liter carafes. "I wish we could take more," said the secretary, "but you heard what I told him. We've had to turn away customers for ordinary dinnerware because he shot the last quarter's budget on some Mexican piggy banks some equally enthusiastic importer stuck him with. The 5th floor is packed solid with them. I'll bet they look mighty aesthetic. They're painted with purple cacti." The potter shuddered and caressed the glaze of the sample carafe. The buyer looked up and rumbled, "Ain't you dummies through yakking yet? What good's the secretary for'n if he don't take the burden of detail off'n my back, huh?" "We're all through, Doctor. Are you ready to go?" The buyer grunted peevishly, dropped Wambo-Zambo comics on the floor, and led the way out of the building and down the long corduroy road to the highway. His car was waiting on the concrete. It was, like all contemporary cars, too low slung to get over the logs. He climbed down into the car and started the motor with a tremendous sparkle and roar. "Gomez Laplace," called out the potter under cover of the noise. "Did anything come of the radiation program they were working on the last time I was on duty at the pole?" "The same old fallacy," said the secretary gloomily. "It stopped us on mutation, it stopped us on culling, it stopped us on segregation, and now it's stopped us on hypnosis. Well, I'm scheduled back to the grind in 9 days. Time for another firing right now. I've got a new luster to try. I'll miss you. I shall be vacationing, running the drafting room of the new Century Engineering Corporation in Denver. They're going to put up a 200-story office building, and naturally somebody's got to be on hand." "Naturally," said Hawkins with a sour smile. There was an ear-piercing sweet blast as the buyer leaned on the horn button. Also, a yard-tall jet of what looked like flame spurted up from the car's radiator cap. The car's power plant was a gas turbine and had no radiator. "I'm coming, Doctor," said the secretary dispiritedly. He climbed down into the car, and it whooshed off with much flame and noise. The potter, depressed, wandered back up the corduroy road and contemplated his cooling kilns. The rustling wind in the boughs was obscuring the creak and mutter of the shrinking refractory brick. Hawkins wondered about the number 2 kiln, a reduction fire on a load of lusterware mugs. Had the clay chinking excluded the air? Had it been a properly smoky blaze? Would it do any harm if he just took one close... Common sense took Hawkins by the scruff of the neck and yanked him over to the tool shed. He got out his pick and resolutely set off on a prospecting jaunt to a hummocky field that might yield some oxides. He was especially low on coppers. The long walk left him sweating hard, with his lust for a peek into the kiln quiet in his breast. He swung his pick, almost at random, into one of the hummocks. It clanged on a stone which he excavated. A largely obliterated inscription said, "Ursity of Shik, Ogical Labra, Beloved Memory of Killed in Act." The potter swore mildly. He had hoped the field would turn out to be a cemetery, preferably a once fashionable cemetery full of once massive bronze caskets moldered into oxides of tin and copper. Well, hell, maybe there was some around anyway. He headed lackadaisically for the second largest hillock and sliced into it with his pick. There was a stone to undercut and topple into a trench, and then the potter was very glad he'd struck it. His nostrils were filled with the bitter smell, and the dirt was tinged with the exciting blue of copper salts. The pick went clang. Hawkins, puffing, pried up a stainless steel plate that was quite badly stained and was also marked with incised letters. It seemed to have pulled loose from rotting bronze. There were rivets on the back that brought up flakes of green patina. The potter wiped off the surface dirt with his sleeve, turned it to catch the sunlight obliquely, and read, "Honest John Barlow. Honest John, famed in university annals, represents a challenge which medical science has not yet answered, revival of a human being accidentally thrown into a state of suspended animation. In 1988, Mr. Barlow, a leading Evanston real estate dealer, visited his dentist for treatment of an impacted wisdom tooth. His dentist requested and received permission to use the experimental anesthetic cycloparadigmethanol B7 developed at the university. After administration of the anesthetic, the dentist resorted to his drill. By freakish mischance, a short circuit in his machine delivered 220 volts of 60-cycle current into the patient. In a damage suit instituted by Mrs. Barlow against the dentist, the university, and the makers of the drill, a jury found for the defendants. Mr. Barlow never got up from the dentist's chair and was assumed to have died of poisoning, electrocution, or both. Morticians preparing him for embalming discovered, however, that their subject was, though certainly not living, just as certainly not dead. The university was notified, and a series of exhaustive tests was begun, including attempts to duplicate the trance state on volunteers. After a bad run of 7 cases, which ended fatally, the attempts were abandoned. Honest John was long an exhibit at the University Museum, and livened many a football game as mascot of the university's Blue Crushers. The bounds of taste were overstepped, however, when a pledge to Sigma Delta Chi was ordered in 03 to kidnap Honest John from his loosely guarded glass museum case and introduce him into the Rachel Swanson Memorial Girls Gymnasium shower room. On May 22, 2003, the University Board of Regents issued the following order: By unanimous vote, it is directed that the remains of honest John Barlow be removed from the University Museum and conveyed to the University's Lieutenant James Scott III Memorial Biological Laboratories, and there be securely locked in a specially prepared vault. It is further directed that all possible measures for the preservation of these remains be taken by the laboratory administration, and that access to these remains be denied to all persons except qualified scholars authorized in writing by the board. The board reluctantly takes this action in view of recent notices and photographs in the nation's press which, to say the least, reflect but small credit upon the university. It was far from his field, but Hawkins understood what had happened. An early and accidental blundering into the bare bones of the Levantman shock anesthesia, which had since been replaced by other methods. To bring subjects out of Levantman shock, you let them have a squirt of simple saline in the trigeminal nerve. Interesting. And now about that bronze. He heaved the pick into the rotting green salts, expecting no resistance, and almost fractured his wrist. Something down there was solid. He began to flake off the oxides. A half hour of work brought him down to phosphorus bronze, a huge casting of the almost incorruptible metal. It had weakened structurally over the centuries. He could fit the point of his pick under a corroded boss and pry off great creaking and grumbling striata of the stuff. Hawkins wished he had an archaeologist with him, but didn't dream of returning to his shop and calling one to take over the find. He was an all-around man, by choice, and in his free time an artist in clay and glaze. By necessity, an automotive, electronics, and atomic engineer, who could also swing a project in traffic control, individual and group psychology, architecture, or tool design. He didn't yell for a specialist every time something out of his line came up. There were so few with so much to do. He trenched around his find, discovering that it was a great brick-shaped bronze mass with an excitingly hollow sound. A long strip of moldering metal from one of the long vertical faces pulled away, exposing red rust that went whoosh and was sucked into the interior of the mass. It had been de-aired, thought Hawkins, and there must have been an inner jacket of glass which had crystallized through the centuries and quietly crumbled at the first clang of his pick. He didn't know what a vacuum would do to a subject of Levantman shock, but he had hopes. Nor did he quite understand what a real estate dealer was, but it might have something to do with pottery. And anything might have a bearing on topic number 1. He flung his pick out of the trench, climbed out, and set off at a dog trot for his shop. A little rummaging turned up a hypo, and there was a plastic container of salt in the kitchen. Back at his dig, he chipped for another half hour to expose the juncture of lid and body. The hinges were hopeless. He smashed them off. Hawkins extended the telescopic handle of the pick for the best leverage, fitted its point into a deep pit, set its built-in fulcrum, and heaved. 5 more heaves, and he could see inside the vault what looked like a dusty marble statue. 10 more, and he could see that it was the naked body of honest John Barlow, Evanston real estate dealer, uncorrupted by time. The potter found the apex of the trigeminal nerve with his needle's point and gave him 60 cc. In an hour, Barlow's chest began to pump. In another hour he rasped, "Did it work?" "Did it?" muttered Hawkins. Barlow opened his eyes and stirred, looked down, turned his hands before his eyes. "I'll sue," he screamed. "My clothes, my fingernails." A horrid suspicion came over his face, and he clapped his hands to his hairless scalp. "My hair!" he wailed. "I'll sue you for every penny you've got. That release won't mean a damn thing in court. I didn't sign away my hair and clothes and fingernails." "They'll grow back," said Hawkins casually. "Also your epidermis. Those parts of you weren't alive, you know, so they weren't preserved like the rest of you. I'm afraid the clothes are gone, though." "What is this, the university hospital?" demanded Barlow. "I want a phone. No, you phone. tell my wife I'm all right, and tell Sam Immerman, he's my lawyer, to get over here right away. Greenleaf 74022. Ow! He had tried to sit up, and a portion of his pink skin rubbed against the inner surface of the casket, which was powdered by the ancient crystallized glass. What the hell did you guys do? Boil me alive? Oh, you're going to pay for this. You're all right, said Hawkins, wishing now he had a reference book to clear up several obscure terms. Your epidermis will start growing immediately. You're not in the hospital. Look here. He handed Barlow the stainless steel plate that had labeled the casket. After a suspicious glance, the man started to read. Finishing, he laid the plate carefully on the edge of the vault and was silent for a spell. Poor Verna, he said at last. It doesn't say whether she was stuck with the court costs. Do you happen to know? No, said the Potter. All I know is what was on the plate and how to revive you. The dentist accidentally gave you a dose of what we call Levantman's shock anesthesia. We haven't used it in centuries. It was powerful, but too dangerous. Centuries? brooded the man. Centuries? I'll bet Sam swindled her out of her eye teeth. Poor Verna. How long ago was it? What year is this? Hawkins shrugged. We call it 7-B-936. That's no help to you. It takes a long time for these metals to oxidize. Like that movie, Barlow muttered. Who would have thought it? Poor Verna. He blubbered and sniffled, reminding Hawkins powerfully of the fact that he had been found under a flat rock. Almost angrily, the Potter demanded, How many children did you have? None yet, sniffed Barlow. My first wife didn't want them, but Verna wants one. Wanted one, but we were going to wait until... Of course, said the Potter, feeling a savage desire to tell him off, blast him to hell and gone for his work, but he choked it down. There was the problem to think of. There was always the problem to think of. And this poor blubberer might unexpectedly supply a clue. Hawkins would have to pass him on. Come along, Hawkins said. My time is short. Barlow looked up, outraged. How can you be so unfeeling? I'm a human being like... The Los Angeles-Chicago rocket thundered overhead, and Barlow broke off in mid-complaint. Beautiful, he breathed, following it with his eyes. Beautiful. He climbed out of the vault, too interested to be pained by its roughness against his infantile skin. After all, he said briskly, this should have its sunny side. I never was much one for reading, but this is just like one of those stories, and I ought to make some money out of it, shouldn't I? He gave Hawkins a shrewd glance. You want money? asked the Potter. Here. He handed over a fistful of change and bills. You'd better put my shoes on. It'll be about a quarter mile. Oh, and you're, modest? Yes, that was the word. Here. Hawkins gave him his pants, but Barlow was excitedly counting the money. 85, 86, and his dollars, too. I thought it'd be credits, or whatever they call them, e pluribus unum and liberty, just different faces. Say, is there a catch to this? Are these real, genuine, honest 22-cent dollars like we had, or just wallpaper? They're quite all right, I assure you, said the Potter. I wish you'd come along. I'm in a hurry. The man babbled as they stumped toward the shop. Where are we going? The Council of Scientists? The World Coordinator, or something like that? Who? Oh, no. We call them President and Congress. No, that wouldn't do any good at all. I'm just taking you to see some people. I ought to make plenty out of this. Plenty. I could write books. Get some smart young fellow to put it into words for me, and I'll bet I could turn out a bestseller. What's the setup of things like that? It's about like that. Smart young fellows, but there aren't any bestsellers anymore. People don't read much nowadays. We'll find something equally profitable for you to do. Back in the shop, Hawkins gave Barlow a suit of clothes, deposited him in the waiting room, and called Central in Chicago. Take him away, he pleaded. I have time for one more firing, and he blathers and blathers. I haven't told him anything. Perhaps we should just turn him loose and let him find his own level, but there's a chance." "The problem," agreed Central. "Yes, there's a chance." The potter delighted Barlow by making him a cup of coffee with a cube that not only dissolved in cold water but heated the water to boiling point. Killing time, Hawkins chatted about the rocket Barlow had admired and had to haul himself up short. He had almost told the real estate man what its top speed really was. Almost indeed revealed that it was not a rocket. He regretted, too, that he had so casually handed Barlow a couple of $100. The man seemed obsessed with fear that they were worthless since Hawkins refused to take a note or IOU or even a definite promise of repayment. But Hawkins couldn't go into details and was very glad when a stranger arrived from Central. "Tinny Pete from Algeciras," the stranger told him swiftly as the two of them met at the door. "Psychist for Poprob Polyline Special Overtake Barlow." "Thank heavens," said Hawkins. "Barlow," he told the man from the past, "this is Tinny Pete. He's going to take care of you and help you make lots of money." The psychist stayed for a cup of coffee, whose preparation had delighted Barlow, and then conducted the real estate man down the corridor road to his car, leaving the potter to speculate on whether he could at last crack his kilns. Hawkins, abruptly dismissing Barlow and the problem, happily picked the chinking from around the door of the number 2 kiln, prying it open a trifle. A blast of heat and the heady, smoky scent of the reduction fire delighted him. He peered and saw a corner of a shelf glowing cherry red, becoming obscured by wavering black areas as it lost heat through the opened door. He slipped a charred wood panel under a mug on the shelf and pulled it out as a sample, the hairs on the back of his hand curling and scorching. The mug cracked and pinged, and Hawkins sighed happily. The bismuth resonate luster had fired to perfection. A haunting film of silvery black metal with strange bluish lights in it as it turned before the eyes, and the problem of population seemed very far away to Hawkins then. Barlow and Tinny Pete arrived at the concrete highway where the psychist's car was parked at a safety bay. "What a boat!" gasped the man from the past. "Boat? No, that's my car." Barlow surveyed it with awe. Swept back lines, deep-drawn compound curves, kilograms of chrome. He ran his hand futilely over the door, or was it the door, in a futile search for a handle, and asked respectfully, "How fast does it go?" The psychist gave him a keen look and said slowly, 250, you can tell by the speedometer." "Wow, my old Chevy couldn't hit 100 on a straightaway, but you're out of my class, mister." Tinny Pete somehow got a huge low door open, and Barlow descended 3 steps into immense cushions, floundering over to the right. He was too fascinated to pay serious attention to his flayed dermis. The dashboard was a lovely wilderness of dials, plugs, indicators, lights, scales, and switches. The psychist climbed down into the driver's seat and did something with his feet. The motor started like lighting a blowtorch as big as a silo. Wallowing around in the cushions, Barlow saw through a rear-view mirror a tremendous exhaust filled with brilliant white sparkles. "Do you like it?" yelled the psychist. "It's terrific," Barlow yelled back. He was shut up as the car pulled out from the bay into the road with a great vroom. A gale roared past Barlow's head, though the window seemed to be closed. The impression of speed was terrific. He located the speedometer on the dashboard and saw it climb past 90, 100, 150, 200. "Fast enough for me," yelled the psychist, noting that Barlow's face fell in repose. "Radio?" He passed over a surprisingly light object like a football helmet with no trailing wires, and pointed to a row of buttons. Barlow put on the helmet, glad to have the roar of air stilled, and pushed a push button. It lit up satisfyingly, and Barlow settled back even further for a sample of the brave New World super-modern taste and ingenious entertainment. "Take it and stick it," a voice roared in his ears. He snatched off the helmet and gave the psychist an injured look. Tinny Pete grinned and turned the dial associated with the push-button layout. The man from the past donned the helmet again and found the voice had lowered to normal. "The show of shows, the super show, the super-duper show, the quiz of quizzes. Take it and stick it." There were shrieks of laughter in the background. "Here we got the contestants all ready to go. You know how we work it. I hand a contestant a triangle-shaped cutout, and like that down the line. Now we got these here boards. They got cutout places the same shape as the triangles and things, only they're all different shapes. And the first contestant that sticks the cutouts into the board, he wins. Now I'm gonna interview the first contestant. Right here, honey. What's your name?" "Name? How would you like that, folks? She don't remember her name. Ha! Would you buy that for a quarter?" The question was spoken with arch significance, and the audience shrieked, howled, and whistled its appreciation. It was dull listening when you don't know the punch lines and catch lines. Barlow pushed another button with his free hand, ready at the volume control. "Latest from Washington, it's about Senator Hull Mendoza. He is still attacking the Bureau of Fisheries. The North Carolina syndicalist says he's got affidavits that John Kingsley Schultz is a blue nose from way back. He didn't publistat the affidavits, but he says they say that Kingsley Schultz saw at Blue Nose meetings at Oregon State College and later at Florida University. Kingsley Schultz says he gonna confess he did major in fly casting at Oregon and got his Ph.D. in game fish at Florida." And here is a quote from Kingsley Schultz. "Hull Mendoza don't know what he's talking about. He should drop dead." Unquote. Hull Mendoza says he won't publistat the affidavits to protect his sources. He says they were sworn by 3 former employees of the Bureau, which was fired for incompetence and incompatibility by Kingsley Schultz. Elsewhere, there was the usual run of traffic accidents. A 3-way pileup of cars on Route 66 going out of Chicago took 12 lives. The Chicago-Los Angeles morning rocket crashed and exploded in the Mojave, whatever you call it, desert. All the 94 people aboard got killed. A Civil Aeronautics Authority investigator on the scene says that the pilot was buzzing herds of sheep and didn't pull out in time. Hey, here's a hot one from New York. A diesel tug ran wild in the harbor while the crew was below and shoved in the port bow of the luxury liner SS Placentia. He says the ship filled and sank, taking the lives of an estimated 180 passengers and 50 crew members. 6 divers went down to study the wreckage, but they died too when their suits turned out to be full of little holes. And here is the bulletin I just got from Denver. It seems... Barlow took off the headset uncomprehendingly. He seems so callous, he yelled at the driver. I was listening to a newscast. Tinny Pete took his head and pointed at his ears. The roar of air was deafening. Barlow frowned baffledly and stared out of the window. A glowing sign said, Moogs, would you buy it for a quarter? He didn't know what Moogs was or where. The illustration showed an incredibly proportioned girl, 99.9% naked, writhing passionately in animated full color. The roadside jingle was still with him, but with a new feature. Radar or something spotted the car and alerted the lines of the jingle. Each in turn sped along a roadside track, even with the car, so it could be read before the next line was alerted. If there's a girl you want to get, defocalize unromantic sweat. Armpito. Another animated job in 2 panels, the familiar before and after. The first said, "Just any cigar?" and was illustrated with a 2-person domestic tragedy of a wife holding her nose while her coarse and red-faced husband puffed a slimy-looking rope. The second panel glowed, "Ore velvuta abajo," and was illustrated with— Barlow blushed and looked at his feet until they had passed the sign. "Coming into Chicago," bawled Tinny Pete. Other cars were showing up, all of them dreamboats. Watching them, Barlow began to wonder if he knew what a kilometer was exactly. They seemed to be traveling so slowly, if you ignore the rushing air past your ears and didn't let the speedy lines of the dreamboats fool you. He could have sworn they were really crawling along at 25, with occasional bursts up to 30. How much was a kilometer anyway? The city loomed ahead, and it was just what it ought to be. Towering skyscrapers, overhead ramps, landing platforms for helicopters. He clutched at the cushions. Those 2 copters, He didn't see what happened because their apparent collision courses took them behind a giant building. Screamingly sweet blasts of sound surrounded them as they stopped for a red light. "What the hell is going on here?" said Barlow in a shrill, frightened voice. Because the braking time was just about 0, he wasn't hurled against the dashboard. "Who's kidding who?" "Why, what's the matter?" demanded the driver. The light changed to green, and he started to pick up. Barlow stiffened as he realized that the rush of air past his ears began just a brief, unreal split second before the car was actually moving. He grabbed for the door handle on his side. The city grew on them slowly, scattered buildings, denser buildings, taller buildings, and a red light ahead. The car rolled to a stop in 0 braking time. The rush of air cut off an instant after it stopped, and Barlow was out of the car and running frenziedly down a sidewalk 1 instant after that. "They'll track me down," he thought, panting. "It's a secret police thing. They'll get you. Mind-reading machines, television eyes everywhere. Afraid you'll tell their slaves about freedom and stuff. They don't let anybody cross them, like that story I once read." Winded, he slowed to a walk and congratulated himself that he had guts enough not to turn around. That was what they always watched for. Walking, he was just another business-suited back among hundreds. He would be safe. A hand tumbled from a large, coarse, handsome face thrust close to his. "What's the matter bumping into people like you own a sidewalk? Got a mind to slam you and a mush you busted." It was neither the mad potter nor the mad driver. "Excuse me," said Barlow. "What did you say?" "Oh, yeah?" yelled the stranger dangerously, and waited for an answer. Barlow, with the feeling that he had somehow been suckered into the short end of an intricate land title deal, heard himself reply belligerently, "Yeah." The stranger let go of his shoulder and snarled. "Oh, yeah? Yeah," said Barlow, yanking his jacket back into shape. "Ah," snarled the stranger, with more contempt and disgust than ferocity. He added an obscenity current in Barlow's time, a standard but physiologically impossible directive, and strutted off, hulking his shoulders and balling his fists. Barlow walked on, trembling. Evidently he had handled it well enough. He stopped at a red light while the long, low dreamboats roared before him, and pedestrians in the sidewalk flow with him threaded their way through the stream of cars. Brakes screamed, fenders clanged and dented, hoarse cries flew back and forth between drivers and walkers. He leaped back frantically as one car swerved over an arc of sidewalk to miss another. The signal changed to green. The cars kept on coming for about 30 seconds and then dwindled to an occasional light runner. Barlow crossed warily and leaned against a vending machine, blowing big breaths. "Look natural," he told himself. "Do something normal. Buy something from the machine." He fumbled out some change, got a newspaper for a dime, a handkerchief for a quarter, and a candy bar for another quarter. The faint chocolate smell made him ravenous suddenly. He clawed at the glassy wrapper printed Quigley's quite futilely for a few seconds, and then it divided neatly by itself. The bar made 3 good bites, and he bought 2 more and gobbled them down. Thirsty, he drew a carbonated orange drink in another one of the glassy wrappers from the machine for another dime. When he fumbled with it, it divided neatly and spilled all over his knees. Barlow decided he had been there long enough and walked on. The shop windows were shop windows. People still wore and bought clothes, still smoked and bought tobacco, still ate and bought food, and they still went to the movies, he saw with pleased surprise as he passed and then returned to a glittering place whose sign said it was the Bijou. The place seemed to be showing a quintuple feature. Babies are terrible, don't have children, and the Connolly Kid. It was irresistible. He paid $1 and went in. He caught the tail end of the Connolly Kid in 3-dimensional, full-color, full-scent production. It appeared to be an interplanetary saga winding up with a chase scene and a reconciliation between estranged hero and heroine. Babies are terrible and don't have children were fantastic arguments against parenthood. The grotesquely exaggerated dangers of painful graphic childbirth, vicious children, old parents beaten and starved by their sadistic offspring. The audience, Barlow astoundedly noted, was placidly chomping sweets and showing no particular signs of revulsion. The coming attractions drove him into the lobby. Fanfares were shattering, the blazing colors blinding, and the added sense stomach-heaving. When his eyes again became accustomed to the moderate lighting of the lobby, he groped his way to a bench and opened the newspaper he had bought. It turned out to be the racing sheet, which afflicted him with a crushing sense of loss. The familiar boxed index in the lower left-hand corner of the front page showed almost unbearably that Churchill Downs and Empire City were still in business. Blinking back tears, he turned to the past performances at Churchill. They weren't using abbreviations anymore, and the pages because of that were single column instead of double, but it was all the same. Or was it? He squinted at the first race, a 3/4-mile maiden claimer for $1,300. Incredibly, the track record was 2 minutes, 10 3/5 seconds. Any beetle in his time could have knocked off the 3/4 in 1:15. It was the same for the other distances, much worse for route events. What the hell had happened to everything? He studied the form of a 5-year-old brown mare in the second and couldn't make head or tails of it. She'd won and lost and placed and showed and lost and placed without rhyme or reason. She looked like a front runner for a couple of races, and then she looked like a no-good pig, and then she looked like a mutter, but the next time it rained, she wasn't. And then she was a stayer, and then she was a pig again. In a good $5,000 allowance event, too. Barlow looked at the other entries, and it slowly dawned on him that they were all like the 5-year-old brown mare. Not a single damned horse running had the slightest trace of class. Somebody sat down beside him and said, "That's the story." Barlow whirled to his feet and saw it was Tinny Pete, his driver. "I was in doubts about telling you," said the psychist, "but I see you have some growing suspicions of the truth. Please don't get excited. It's all right, I tell you." "So you've got me," said Barlow. "Got you? Don't pretend. I can put 2 and 2 together. You're the secret police. You and the rest of the aristocrats live in luxury on the sweat of these oppressed slaves. You're afraid of me because you have to keep them ignorant." There was a bellow of bright laughter from the psychist that got them blank looks from other patrons in the lobby. The laughter didn't sound at all sinister. "Let's get out of here," said Tinny Pete, still chuckling. "You couldn't possibly have it more wrong." He engaged Barlow's arm and led him to the street. "The actual truth is that the millions of workers live in luxury on the sweat of the handful of aristocrats. I shall probably die before my time of overwork, unless—" he gave Barlow a speculative look. "You may be able to help us." "I know that gag," sneered Barlow. "I made money in my time, and to make money you have to get people on your side. Go ahead and shoot me if you want, but you're not going to make a fool out of me." "You nasty little ingrate," snapped the psychist, with a kaleidoscopic change of mood. "This damned mess is all your fault, and the fault of people like you. Now come along and no more of your nonsense." He yanked Barlow into an office building lobby and an elevator that disconcertedly went whoosh loudly as it rose. The real estate man's knees were wobbly as the psychist pushed him from the elevator, down a corridor, and into an office. A hawk-faced man rose from a plain chair as the door closed behind them. After an angry look at Barlow, he asked the psychist, "Why was I called from the pole to inspect this unget-up-dandard? I've deep-probed, et-fined, quasi-chance, ex-him, proprobaticline," said the psychist soothingly. "Doubt," grunted the hawk-faced man. "Try," suggested Tinny Pete. "Very well, Mr. Barlow. I understand you and your lamented had no children. What of it? Think this of it. You were a blind, selfish, stupid ass to tolerate economic and social conditions which penalized childbearing by the prudent and foresighted. You made us what we are today, and I want you to know that we are far from satisfied. Damn fool rockets, damn fool automobiles, damn fool cities with overhead ramps." "As far as I can see," said Barlow, "you're running down the best features of time. Are you crazy?" "The rockets aren't rockets. They're turbojets. Good turbojets, but the fancy shell around them makes for a bad drag. The automobiles have a top speed of 100 kilometers per hour. A kilometer is, if I recall my paleolinguistics, 3/5 of a mile. And the speedometers are all rigged accordingly, so that drivers will think they're going 250. The cities are ridiculous, expensive, unsanitary, wasteful conglomerations of people who would be better off and more productive if they were spread over the countryside. We need rockets and trick speedometers in cities because, while you and your kind were being prudent and foresighted and not having children, the migrant workers, slum dwellers, and tenant farmers were shiftlessly and short-sightedly having children, breeding. My God, how they bred." "Wait a minute," objected Barlow. "There were lots of people in our crowd who had 2 or 3 children. The attrition of accidents, illness, wars, and such took care of that. Your intelligence was bred out. It is gone. Children that should have been born never were. The just average, they'll-get-along majority took over the population. The average IQ now is 45. "But that's far in the future." "So are you," grunted the hawk-faced man sourly. "But who are you people?" "Just people, real people. Some generations ago, the geneticists realized at last that nobody was going to pay any attention to what they said, so they abandoned words for deeds. Specifically, they formed and recruited for a closed corporation intended to maintain and improve the breed. We are their descendants, about 3 million of us. There are 5 billion of the others, so we are their slaves. During the past couple of years, I've designed a skyscraper, kept Billings Memorial Hospital here in Chicago running, headed off war with Mexico, and directed traffic at LaGuardia Field in New York. I don't understand. Why don't you let them go to hell in their own way?" The man grimaced. "We tried it once for 3 months. We holed up at the South Pole and waited. They didn't notice it. Some drafting room people were missing, some chief nurses didn't show up, minor government people on the non-policy level couldn't be located. It didn't seem to matter. In a week there was hunger. In 2 weeks there were famine and plague. In 3 weeks, war and anarchy. We called off the experiment. It took us most of the next generation to get things squared away again." "But why didn't you let them kill each other off?" 5 billion corpses mean about 500 million tons of rotting flesh. Barlow had another idea. Why don't you sterilize them? 2.5 billion operations is a lot of operations. Because they breed continuously, the job would never be done. I see, like the marching Chinese. Who the devil are they? It was a paradox of my time. Somebody figured out that if all the Chinese in the world were to line up 4 abreast, I think it was, and start marching past a given point, they'd never stop because of the babies that would be born and grow up before they passed the point. That's right. Only instead of a given point, make it the largest conceivable number of operating rooms that we could build and staff. There could never be enough. Say, said Barlow, those movies about babies, was that your propaganda? It was. It doesn't seem to mean a thing to them. We have abandoned the idea of attempting propaganda contrary to a biological drive. So if you work with a biological drive? I know of none which is consistent with an inhibition of fertility. Barlow's face went poker blank, the result of years of careful discipline. You don't, huh? You're the great brains and you can't think of any? Why, no, said the psychist innocently. Can you? That depends. I sold 10,000 acres of Siberian tundra, through a dummy firm, of course, after the partition of Russia. The buyers thought they were getting improved building lots on the outskirts of Kiev. I'd say that was a lot tougher than this job. How so? Asked the hawk-faced man. Those were normal, suspicious customers, and these are morons, born suckers. You just figure out a con they'll fall for, they won't know enough to do any smart checking. The psychist and the hawk-faced man had also had training. They kept themselves from looking with sudden hope at each other. You seem to have something in mind, said the psychist. Barlow's poker face went blanker still. Maybe I have. I haven't heard any offer yet. There's the satisfaction of knowing that you've prevented Earth's resources from being so plundered, the hawk-faced man pointed out, that the race will soon become extinct. I don't know that, Barlow said bluntly. All I have is your word. If you really have a method, I don't think any price would be too great, the psychist offered. Money, said Barlow. All you want? More than you want, the hawk-faced man corrected. Prestige, added Barlow. Plenty of publicity. My picture and my name in the papers and over TV every day. Statues to me, parks and cities and streets and other things named after me. A whole chapter in the history books. The psychist made a facial sign to the hawk-faced man that meant, oh, brother. The hawk-faced man signaled back, steady, boy. It's not too much to ask, the psychist agreed. Barlow, sensing a seller's market, said, power. Power? The hawk-faced man repeated puzzledly. Your own hydro station or nuclear pile? I mean a world dictatorship with me as dictator. Well now, said the psychist, but the hawk-faced man interrupted. It would take a special emergency act of Congress, but the situation warrants it. I think that can be guaranteed. Could you give me some indication of your plan? The psychist asked. Ever hear of lemmings? No. They were, I guess, since you haven't heard of them, little animals in Norway, and every few years they'd swarm to the coast and swim out to sea until they drowned. I figure on putting some lemming urges into the population. How? I'll save that till I get the right signatures on the deal. The hawk-faced man said, I'd like to work with you on it, Barlow. My name is Ryan Ingana. He put out his hand. Barlow looked closely at the hand, then at the man's face. Ryan what? Ingana? That sounds like an African name. It is. My mother's father was a Watusi. Barlow didn't take the hand. I thought you looked pretty dark. I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I don't think I'd be at my best working with you. There must be somebody else just as well qualified, I'm sure. The psychist made a facial sign to Ryan Ngana that meant, "Steady yourself, boy." "Very well," Ryan Ngana told Barlow. "We'll see what arrangement can be made. It's not that I'm prejudiced, you understand. Some of my best friends—" "Mr. Barlow, don't give it another thought. Anybody who could pick on the lemming analogy is going to be useful to us." And so he would, thought Ryan Ngana, alone in the office, after Tinny Pete had taken Barlow up to the helicopter stage. So he would. Poprob had exhausted every rational attempt, and the new Poprob attack lines would have to be irrational or sub-rational. This creature from the past with his lemming legends and its improved building lots would be a fountain of precious, vicious self-interest. Ryan Ngana sighed and stretched. He had to go and run the San Francisco subway. Summoned early from the pole to study Barlow, he left unfinished a nice little theorem. Between interruptions, he was slowly constructing an n-dimensional geometry whose foundations and superstructure owed no debt whatsoever to intuition. Upstairs, waiting for a helicopter, Barlow was explaining to Tinny Pete that he had nothing against Negroes, and Tinny Pete wished he had some of Ryan Ngana's imperturbability and humor for the ordeal. The helicopter took them to International Airport, where, Tinny Pete explained, Barlow would leave for the pole. The man from the past wasn't sure he'd like a dreary waste of ice and cold. "It's all right," said the psychist. "A civilized layout, warm, pleasant. You'll be able to work more efficiently there. All the facts at your fingertips, a good secretary." "I'll need a pretty big staff," said Barlow, who had learned from thousands of deals never to take the first offer. "I mean a private, confidential one," said Tinny Pete ruddily. "But you can have as many as you want. You'll naturally have top priority if you really have a workable plan." "Let's not forget this dictatorship angle," said Barlow. He didn't know that the psychist would just as readily have promised him deification to get him happily on the rocket for the pole. Tinny Pete had no wish to be torn limb from limb. He knew very well that it would end that way if the population learned from this anachronism that there was a small elite which considered itself head, shoulders, trunk, and groin above the rest. The fact that this assumption was perfectly true, and the fact that the elite was condemned by its superiority to a life of the most grinding toil would not be considered. The difference would. The psychist finally put Barlow aboard the rocket with some 30 people, real people, headed for the pole. Barlow was airsick all the way because of a post-hypnotic suggestion Tinny Pete had planted in him. One idea was to make him as adverse as possible to a return trip, and another idea was to spare the other passengers from his aggressive, talkative company. Barlow, during the first day at the pole, was reminded of his first day in the army. It was the same "now where the hell are we going to put you" business, until he took a firm line with them. Then, instead of acting like supply sergeants, they acted like hotel clerks. It was a wonderfully calculated build-up, and one that he failed to suspect. After all, in his time, a visitor from the past would have been lionized. At the day's end, he reclined in a snug underground billet with the 60-mile gales roaring yards overhead, and tried to put 2 and 2 together. It was like old times, he thought, like a coup in real estate where you had the competition by the throat, like a 50% rent boost when you knew damn well there was no place for the tenants to move, like smiling when you read over the breakfast orange juice that the city council had decided to build a school on the ground you had acquired by a deal with the city council. And it was simple. He would just sell tundra building lots to eagerly suicidal lemmings. And that was absolutely all there was to solving the problem that had these double domes spinning. They'd have to work out most of the details, naturally, but what the hell, that was what subordinates were for. He'd need specialists in advertising, engineering, communications. Did they know anything about hypnotism? That might be helpful. If not, there'd have to be a lot of bribery done. But he'd make sure, damn sure, there were unlimited funds. Just selling building lots to lemmings. He wished, as he fell asleep, that poor Verna could have been in on this. It was his biggest, most stupendous deal. Verna, that sharp shyster Sam Immerman must have swindled her. It began the next day with people coming to visit him. He knew the approach. They merely wanted to be helpful to their illustrious visitor from the past, and would he help fill them in about his era, which unfortunately was somewhat obscure historically, and what did he think could be done about the problem. He told them he was too old to be roped anymore, and they wouldn't get any information out of him until he got a letter of intent from at least the Polar president and a session of the Polar Congress empowered to make him dictator. He got the letter and the session. He presented his program, was asked whether his conscience didn't revolt at its callousness, explained succinctly that a deal was a deal, and anybody who wasn't smart enough to protect himself didn't deserve protection. Caveat emptor, he threw in for scholarship, and had to translate it to, let the buyer beware. He didn't, he stated, give a damn about either the morons or their intelligent slaves. He told them his price, and that was all he was interested in. Would they meet it, or wouldn't they? The Polar president offered to resign in his favor, with certain temporary emergency powers that the Polar Congress would vote him if he thought they were necessary. Barlow demanded the title of world dictator, complete control of world finances, salary to be decided by himself, and the publicity campaigns and historical write-up to begin at once. As for the emergency powers, he added, they are neither to be temporary nor limited. Somebody wanted the floor to discuss the matter with the declared hope that perhaps Barlow would modify his demands. You've got the proposition, Barlow said. I'm not knocking off even 10%. But what if the Congress refuses, sir? The president asked. Then you can stay up here at the pole and try to work it out yourselves. I'll get what I want from the morons. A shrewd operator like me doesn't have to compromise. I haven't got a single competitor in this whole cockeyed moronic era. Congress waived debate and voted by show of hands. Barlow won unanimously. You don't know how close you came to losing me, he said in his first official address to the joint houses. I'm not the boy to haggle. Either I get what I ask or I go elsewhere. The first thing I want is to see designs for a new palace for me. Nothing unostentatious either. And your best painters and sculptors to start working on my portraits and statues. Meanwhile, I'll get my staff together. He dismissed the Polar president and the Polar Congress, telling them that he'd let them know when the next meeting would be. A week later, the program started with North America the first target. Mrs. Garvey was resting after dinner before the ordeal of turning on the dishwasher. The TV, of course, was on, and it said, "Oh," long, shuddery, and ecstatic, the cue for the Parfum Assault Criminal spot commercial. "Girls," said the announcer hoarsely, "do you want your man? It's easy to get him, easy as a trip to Venus." "Huh?" said Mrs. Garvey. "What's the matter?" snorted her husband, starting out of a doze. "Did you hear that?" "What?" "He said easy like a trip to Venus." "So?" "Well, I thought you couldn't get to Venus. I thought they just had that one rocket thing that crashed on the moon." Women don't keep up with the news," said Garvey righteously, subsiding again. "Oh," said his wife uncertainly. And the next day, on Henry's Other Mistress, there was a new character who had just breezed in, Buzz Renshaw, master rocket pilot of the Venus run. On Henry's Other Mistress, the broadcast drama about you and your neighbors, folksy people, ordinary people, real people, Mrs. Garvey listened with amazement over a cooling cup of coffee as Buzz made hay of her hazy convictions. Mona. Darling, it's so good to see you again. Buzz. You don't know how I've missed you on that dreary Venus run. Sound. Venetian blind run down, key turned in door lock. Mona. Was it very dull, dearest? Buzz. Let's not talk about my humdrum job, darling. Let's talk about us. Sound. Creaking bed. Well, the program was back to normal at last. That evening, Mrs. Garvey tried to ask again whether her husband was sure about those rockets, but he was dozing right through Take It and Stick It, so she watched the screen and forgot the puzzle. She was still rocking with laughter at the gag line, "Would you buy it for a quarter?" when the commercial went on for the detergent powder she always faithfully loaded her dishwasher with on the 1st of every month. The announcer displayed mountains of suds from a tiny piece of the stuff and coyly asked, "Of course, Clino don't lay around for you to pick up like the soap root on Venus, but it's pretty cheap and it's almost pretty near just as good. So for us plain folk who ain't lucky enough to live up there on Venus, Clino is the real cleaning stuff." Then the chorus went into their "Clino is the stuff" jingle, but Mrs. Garvey didn't hear it. She was a stubborn woman, but it occurred to her that she was very sick indeed. She didn't want to worry her husband. The next day she quietly made an appointment with her family Freud. In the waiting room she picked up a fresh copy of Reader's Pablum and put it down with a faint palpitation. The lead article, according to the table of contents on the cover, was titled, "The Most Memorable Venusian I Ever Met." "The Freud will see you now," said the nurse, and Mrs. Garvey tottered into his office. His traditional glasses and whiskers were reassuring. She choked out the ritual, "Freud, forgive me, for I have neuroses." He chanted the antiphonal, "Tut, my dear girl, what seems to be the trouble?" "I got like a hole in the head," she quavered. "I seem to forget all kinds of things. Things like everybody seems to know and I don't." "Well, that happens to everybody occasionally, my dear. I suggest a vacation on Venus." The Freud stared open-mouthed at the empty chair. His nurse came in and demanded, "Hey, you see how she screamed? What was the matter with her?" He took off his glasses and whiskers meditatively. "You can search me. I told her she should maybe try a vacation on Venus." A momentary bafflement came into his face, and he dug through his desk drawers until he found a copy of the 4-color, profusely illustrated journal of his profession. It had come that morning, and he had lip-read it, though looking mostly at the pictures. He leafed through the article, "Advantages of the Planet Venus in Rest Cures." "It's right there," he said. The nurse looked. "It sure is," she agreed. "Why shouldn't it be?" "The trouble with these neurotics," decided the Freud, "is that they all the time got to fight reality. Show in the next twitch." He put on his glasses and whiskers again and forgot Mrs. Garvey and her strange behavior. "Freud, forgive me, for I have neuroses." "Tut, my dear girl, what seems to be the trouble?" Like many cures of mental disorders, Mrs. Garvey's was achieved largely by self-treatment. She disciplined herself sternly out of the crazy notion that there had been only one rocket ship and that one a failure. She could join, without wincing, eventually, in any conversation on the desirability of Venus as a place to retire, on its fabulous floral profusion. Finally, she went to Venus. All her friends were trying to book passage with the Evening Star Travel and Real Estate Corporation, but naturally the demand was crushing. She considered herself lucky to get a seat at last for the 2-week summer cruise. The spaceship took off from a place called Los Alamos, New Mexico. It looked just like all the spaceships on television and in the picture magazines, but was more comfortable than you would expect. Mrs. Garvey was delighted with the 50 or so fellow passengers assembled before takeoff. They were from all over the country, and she had a distinct impression that they were on the brainy side. The captain, a tall, hawk-faced, impressive fellow called Ryan something or other, welcomed them aboard and trusted that their trip would be a memorable one. He regretted that there would be nothing to see because, due to the meteorite season, the ports would be dogged down. It was disappointing, yet reassuring that the line was taking no chances. There was the expected momentary discomfort at takeoff, and then 2 monotonous days of droning travel through space to be whiled away in the lounge at cards or craps. The landing was a routine bump, and the voyagers were issued tablets to swallow to immunize them against any minor ailments. When the tablets took effect, the lock was opened and Venus was there. It looked much like a tropical island on Earth, except for a blanket of cloud overhead. But it had a heady, otherworldly quality that was intoxicating and glamorous. The 10 days of the vacation were suffused with a hazy magic. The soap root, as advertised, was free and sudsy. The fruits, mostly tropical varieties transplanted from Earth, were delightful. The simple shelters provided by the travel company were more than adequate for the balmy days and nights. It was with sincere regret that the voyagers filed again into the ship and swallowed more tablets doled out to counteract and sterilize any Venus illnesses they might unwittingly communicate to Earth. Vacationing was one thing, power politics was another. At the pole, a small man was in a soundproof room, his face deathly pale and his body limp in a straight chair. In the American Senate chamber, Senator Hull Mendoza, Sind, North Carolina, was saying, Mr. President and gentlemen, I would be remiss in my duty as a legislature if I didn't bring to the attention of the august body I see here a perilous situation which is fraught with peril. As is well known to members of this august body, the perfection of spaceflight has brought with it a situation I can only describe as fraught with peril. Mr. President and gentlemen, now that swift American rockets now traverse the trackless void of space between this planet and our nearest planetarial neighbor in space, and gentlemen, I refer to Venus, the star of dawn, the brightest jewel in fair Vulcan's diadem. Now, I want to inquire what steps are being taken to colonize Venus with the vanguard of patriotic citizens like those men of yore. Mr. President and gentlemen, there are in this world nations, envious nations, I do not name Mexico, who by fair means or foul may seek to wrest from Columbia's grasp the torch of freedom of speech. Nations whose low living standards and innate depravity give them an unfair advantage over the citizens of our fair republic. This is my program. I suggest that a city of more than 100,000 populations be selected by lot. The citizens of the fortunate city are to be awarded choice lands on Venus, free and clear, to have and to hold and convey to their descendants. And the national government shall provide free transportation to Venus for these citizens. And this program shall continue city by city until there has been deposited on Venus a sufficient vanguard of citizens to protect our manifest rights in that planet. Objections will be raised, for carping critics we have always with us. They will say there isn't enough steel. They will call it a cheap giveaway. I say there is enough steel for one city's population to be transferred to Venus, and that is all that is needed. For when the time comes for the second city to be transferred, the first empty city can be wrecked for the needed steel. And is it a giveaway? Yes, it is the most glorious giveaway in the history of mankind. Mr. President and gentlemen, there is no time to waste. Venus must be American. Black Copperman at the pole opened his eyes and said feebly, The style was a little uneven. Do you think anybody'll notice? You did fine, boy, just fine, Barlow reassured him. Hull Mendoza's bill became law. Drafting machines at the South Pole were busy around the clock, and the Pittsburgh steel mills spewed millions of plates into the Los Alamos spaceport of the Evening Star Travel and Real Estate Corporation. It was going to be Los Angeles for logistic reasons, and the three most accomplished psychokineticists went to Washington and mingled in the crowd at the drawing to make certain that the Los Angeles capsule slithered into the fingers of the blindfolded senator. Los Angeles loved the idea, and a forest of spaceships began to blossom in the desert. They weren't very good spaceships, but they didn't have to be. A team at the pole worked at Barlow's direction on a mail setup. There would have to be letters to and from Venus to keep the slightest taint of suspicions from arising. Luckily, Barlow remembered that the problem had been solved once before by Hitler. Relatives of persons incarcerated in the furnaces of Lubin and Majdanek continued to get cheery postal cards. The Los Angeles flight went off on schedule under tremendous press, newsreel, and television coverage. The world cheered the gallant Angelos who were setting off on their patriotic voyage to the land of milk and honey. The forest of spaceships thundered up and out of sight without untoward incident. Billions envied the Angelos, cramped and on short rations though they were. Wreckers from San Francisco, whose capsule came up second, moved immediately into the City of the Angels for the scrap steel their own flight would require. Senator Hull Mendoza's constituents could do no less. The President of Mexico, hypnotically alarmed at this extension of Yankee imperialismo beyond the stratosphere, launched his own Venus colony program. Across the water, it was England versus Ireland, France versus Germany, China versus Russia, India versus Indonesia. Ancient hatreds grew into the flames that were rocket ships, assailing the air by hundreds daily. Dear Ed, how are you? Sam and I are fine and hope you're fine. It is nice up here like they say with food and clothes growing on trees. I drove by Springfield yesterday and it sure looked funny, all the buildings down, but of course it is worth it if we have to keep the greasers in their place. Do you have any trouble with them on Venus? Drop me a line sometime. Your loving sister, Alma. Dear Alma, I am fine and hope you are fine. It is a fine place here, fine climate and easy living. The doctor told me today that I seem to be 10 years younger. He thinks there is something in the air here keeps people young. We do not have much trouble with the greasers here. They keep to themselves. It is just a question of us outnumbering them and staking out the best places for the Americans. In South Bay, I know a nice little island that I've been saving for you and Sam with lots of blanket trees and ham bushes. Hoping to see you and Sam soon. Your loving brother, Ed. Sam and Alma were on their way shortly. Poprob got a dividend in every nation after the immigration had passed the halfway mark. The lonesome stay-at-homes were unable to bear the melancholy of a low population density. Their conditioning had been to swarms of their kin. After that point, it was possible to foist off the crudest stripped-down accommodations on would-be immigrants. They didn't care. Black Copperman did a final job on President Hull Mendoza, the last job that genius of hypnotics would ever do on any moron, important or otherwise. Hull Mendoza, panic-stricken by his presidency over an emptying nation, joined his constituents. The Independence, aboard which traveled the national government of America, was the most elaborate of all the spaceships, bigger, more comfortable, with a lounge that was handsome, though cramped, and cloakrooms for senators and representatives. It went, however, to the same place as the others, and Black Copperman killed himself, leaving a note that stated, "He couldn't live with my conscience." The day after the American president departed, Barlow flew into a rage. Across his specially built desk were supposed to flow all Poprob high-level documents, and this outrageous thing, called Poprob term apparently, had got into the executive stage before he had even had a glimpse of it. He buzzed for Raji Smith, his statistician. Raji Smith seemed to be at the bottom of it. Pro term seemed to be about first and second and third derivatives, whatever they were. Barlow had a deep distrust of anything more complex than what he called an average. While Raji Smith was still at the door, Barlow snapped, What's the meaning of this? Why haven't I been consulted? How far have you people got, and why have you been working on something I haven't authorized? Didn't want to bother you, Chief, said Raji Smith. It was really a technical matter, kind of a final cleanup. Want to come and see the work? Mollified, Barlow followed his statistician down the corridor. You still shouldn't have gone ahead without my okay, he grumbled. Where the hell would you people have been without me? That's right, Chief. We couldn't have swung it ourselves. Our minds just don't work that way. And all that stuff you knew from Hitler, it wouldn't have occurred to us, like poor Black Copperman. They were in a fair-sized machine shop at the end of a slight upward incline. It was cold. Raji Smith pushed a button that started a motor, and a flood of Arctic light poured in as the roof parted slowly. It showed a small spaceship with the door open. Barlow gaped as Raji Smith took him by the elbow and his other boys appeared. Swenson, the engineer, Susigamushi Duncan, his propellant man, called French advertising. In you go, Chief, said Susigamushi Duncan. This is Poprob term. But I'm the world dictator. You bet, Chief. You'll be in history all right. But this is necessary, I'm afraid. The door was closed. Acceleration slammed Barlow cruelly to the metal floor. Something broke, and warm, wet stuff, salty tasting, ran from his mouth to his chin. Arctic sunlight through a port suddenly became a fierce lancet, stabbing at his eyes. He was out of the atmosphere. Lying twisted and broken under the acceleration, Barlow realized that some things had not changed. That Jack Ketch was never asked to dinner however many shillings you paid him to do your dirty work. That murder will out. That crime pays only temporarily. The last thing he learned was that death is the end of pain. End of The Marching Morons by C. M. Kornbluth. End of 4 science fiction stories by C. M. Kornbluth. These stories were recorded by Phil Chenevert for LibriVox in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 2020. Thank you for listening.